And we're live. I am very excited. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is going to be an exciting time. Basically, what we're going to do is talk about two big questions from philosophy more broadly. And we have two monster YouTubers. I'm very excited for guys that have had success. They put out great content. People have said, hey, we want more. And so without any further ado, I just want to give quick the questions that we'll discuss tonight in the open dialogue. And after that, I'm going to turn it over to Inspiring Philosophy, also known as Mike. And then I will turn it over to Skylar Fiction, also known as Skylar. So they will just give you a quick brief overview of their channels. Their links to their channels can be found in the description below. Totally encourage you to check their stuff out. Give it a listen. Even if it's on the other side, at least you'll know what the other side is saying by checking out their videos. So first, the question we're going to talk about is moral realism true? And the philosophers that we have on tonight will just discuss that in terms of their terms in particular, so I'll leave that for them. The second one will be, is the moral argument for God's existence a sound argument? Very exciting. Two awesome topics in one discussion. So as mentioned, I said I'm going to turn it over to Inspiring Philosophy, whose link is in the description below. So Inspiring Philosophy, would you like to just share a little bit about what you do on your channel?
Yeah, hi, my name's Mike. I run a YouTube channel called Inspiring Philosophy. The goal is to build an apologetic video library. That's to have a video for every question or objection to Christianity out there and have a defense for them as well. So that's kind of what I do on my channel. I try to build videos. I try to do two videos a month. And so that's kind of what we're going through now. We're going to start going through objections to theism this winter, hell, problem of evil, divine hiddenness, and things like that.
Absolutely. Excellent. So totally check it out. And now over to Skylar Fiction. Skylar, if you want to share about what you're doing over at your channel, the floor is yours.
Hey, what's up, everybody? I'm Skylar Fiction. I'm just really super excited to be on here tonight. Two great people here, Inspiring Philosophy and Modern Day Hysteria. Been waiting for this literally all day. It's kind of like a kid on Christmas, basically, waiting to open his presents. So I'm very excited to be here. My channel, basically, I host Christians most of the time. It doesn't have to be necessarily Christians, but theists on to have discussions about Christianity and theology. We do a lot of Bible studies on my channel. But that's the gist of what I do. We have conversations, we debate, and I try to just kind of talk about some of the more interesting topics. One of the things I'll say right up front is I am not a philosopher by any means. I am not as necessarily it's very strong philosophically minded. I do understand a lot of these concepts. So I would just please just remember and ask you to show me some of that Christian charity that many of you Christian brethren have shown me when talking to those philosophically minded people. I may ask a couple more questions just to kind of understand what your position is or to clarify what you may be trying to articulate. So thank you in advance for your patience.
Other than that, philosopher either.
You're pretty philosophically minded. I've watched some of your videos today, and like I said, I even took some stuff away from them, and may actually have changed some of my positions, kind of the way I think about things. So, but I'm sure we'll get into that later. But that's where I'm at. If you like religious conversation, theology talks, Bible studies, check out Skylar Fiction Show and YouTube.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Skylar. So, as Skylar mentioned, I appreciate your kind words, Skylar. These guys, I have to say, that we're having on tonight are they're all business in the sense that not only are they sticking to the arguments or the ideas, but they're also pleasant people. Like if you watch their interactions with people on YouTube, you can see they're patient, they're self-controlled, and you can tell they really are about the ideas rather than about trying to score points or beat somebody up. So that's why I think tonight's going to be a great value, is just getting those ideas out there. So we're starting with, is moral realism true? And we're going to start it off with Inspiring Philosophy. So without any further ado, we are getting started. Inspiring Philosophy, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, as I said before we started, I kind of wanted to know Skylar's position, because mine is, I've been very vocal, I'm a non-natural moral realist. So I just wanted to know what Skylar's position is. So are you a cognitivist or a non-cognitivist?
I'm going to tell you right now, actually watching some of your videos today, I kind of usually I would say I'm a cognitivist, right? I'm a moral subjectivist, on a kind of moral relativism, I guess. But more that basically morals are based on emotions and opinions, and created by the individual. But I will say, part of me, after watching these videos, I kind of lean a little bit now towards emotivism under non-cognitivism. And I kind of could appreciate some of those values and some of that stuff. I'm not quite there yet, like to say I would, throw in my lot with it. But, it was definitely certainly appealing, some of those positions.
Okay. All right. Interesting. So then I guess I kind of want to know, so then you're not really nailed down, but you're definitely not a moral realist is what you're saying.
Correct. Yeah. I just don't see any reason to believe that there's any kind of moral facts, especially within like a naturalism kind of position. I just don't really see any evidence for it. Everybody I've ever talked to, which I've talked to mostly Christians about it, I just really haven't seen any really persuasive arguments for it that made me believe that, morality is, especially when you're talking about realism, that it's separated from the mind, or it can be, that regardless of whether human beings think something is right or wrong, it is right or wrong. I just don't see evidence for that.
So would you at least agree that it's sort of like it's the intuitive starting point? Like most people do feel that like there is some sort of objective sense when it comes to moral values and duties. That's sort of like the intuitive starting point. An example I use is A theory of time seems intuitive, but we have good scientific evidence to suggest the B theory of time is true. So we now hold the B theory of time more or less.
I think, honestly, people don't even think about it. I think people who are philosophically minded or Christian or religious to some degree kind of have those kind of moral positions mapped out and kind of understand the difference between objective and subjective. I think if you were to ask most people, they wouldn't even be able to tell you. I know before I started kind of getting here on YouTube, I didn't have an idea of any of this terminology, what objective meant, what subjective meant when it came to morality, moral realism, these things. I don't think so. I think that, people I think may feel that there are instances where people feel that their morals are real and outside of them. But I don't know if that's necessarily a good argument for moral realism.
Why not?
Just because just like intuition can be wrong, right? And just because you feel something very strongly doesn't make it a case.
Right.
So basically saying, well, it's someone's moral intuition, like they somehow believe that this is objectively true, some kind of moral fact. I don't know how that actually gets you to moral facts besides just having a feeling about something.
So let's say I was a total skeptic, an epistemic skeptic, and I told you, you can't trust your cognitive faculties, you can't have beliefs, you can't trust your intuition that you can trust your cognitive faculties. Would that convince you to not trust your cognitive faculties?
Probably not. You just telling me something wouldn't convince me of anything now.
Okay, then that's kind of where I'm coming from. So I agree with you. We should be skeptical of our intuitions. Intuitions can be wrong. I would never say that they're absolute and that you can't doubt them. But then I would want to know that if moral realism, cognitivism, these are our intuitive starting points, what would be a good reason to sort of doubt that and take more of an anti-realist position, whether it's moral relativism, error theory, form of non-cognitivism? What would be a good reason to doubt those?
Well, I mean, it's just simply just saying how you feel about something. Like just simply saying something how you feel about a certain position doesn't get you anywhere besides just explaining how you feel about something. So if you were to tell me, I think that it's through intuition, I believe killing is wrong, or whatever moral X you want to put in there, like it doesn't do anything for me. It just tells me how you feel about something. It doesn't tell me whether the thing you're talking about is a moral fact or not.
Well, I mean, feelings are not necessarily intuitions. I mean, I can feel pain, but that's not an intuition. I can feel bad. I can feel remorse. That's not an intuition. That's because intuitions are, as Rocher Furlando defines them, they are conscious experiential states. So it's something in consciousness. It's not necessarily a feeling. Those are kind of different because we don't start to study reason with feelings. We start to study and reason with our intuitions. So I don't know if they're really our intuitions you could really say are feelings in that sense. Now, when a non-cognitivist says that, they're equated to emotions, he's not saying that our intuitions are emotions. I mean, he's saying that our moral judgments, our moral values, these are non-cognitive states, but are in our intuitions that they're actually real or wrong. So I don't think that when we say we have an intuition as our starting point, we're not saying it's a feeling.
Then I guess I don't really understand what you mean by intuition. Then what is an intuition?
Okay, well, let me give you an example, because examples are typically pretty good to explain. Are there people in Montreal right now? Okay, without looking it up,
sure.
Would you say yes?
Yeah, but the reason I would say yes is built on a bunch of other evidence and why. Like, I would know that cities have people. I would know the city of Montreal. Like, if you made up a name of a city that I wasn't familiar with, and you gave me that same question, I might say I don't know. I don't know if there's people in that city, because I may not know if it's a real city. Right. I may not know any of that kind of stuff. So, like, simply just pointing out that intuition works on other forms of knowledge that you already have. Cities have people. There is a city called it's in Montreal. Like I said, I don't know how. Once again, I don't know. Just because you have all that knowledge, but that doesn't get you necessarily to that intuition being correct, or that intuition is. Yeah.
Let me stop you there. Yeah, I agree. The intuition is not necessarily correct. It's just our starting point. So it seems like a reasonable conclusion to have, and then we can decide whether or not it is true or not if other evidence were to come into existence. Like,
I don't think it is the starting point, though, is it? Because all the other things before that, like knowing that cities have people, would be a closer starting point to that.
Well,
like,
that would be
all that knowledge that's built up already.
We'd have underlying epistemic knowledge. I mean, obviously, we can't start from a blank slate.
Sure,
but we do have good basic intuitions that we do kind of go on to kind of start with, based on our knowledge of how things work, on our 5 cents. We sort of get these sort of intuitions that we sort of go on. And of course, it doesn't mean they're correct. It just means it's our starting point.
Mm-hmm.
So when I say, are there people in Montreal, it's reasonable to say yes, but it's not necessarily correct. It's just a starting point. It's like, okay, that's a good idea to start with, but we can evaluate it and make sure it actually is factual or not.
I don't know if that's intuition, though. I think that's just using your knowledge and coming to a conclusion. Like, if you ask somebody, are there people in Montreal? I would just be like, well, yeah, cities have people. We know that there are people in that city, that it would be very unlikely all of a sudden the city of Montreal would have no people in it. Like, I don't know if that is an actual example of intuition.
Okay, but what are you kind of basing that on, though? Like, what are you basing that belief on?
Well, I mean, it's true that cities have people, right?
Yeah.
Right, and it would be extremely unlikely that a city would all of a sudden have no people in it, right?
Right.
Like, these are just facts about our reality. So
right.
I don't have to. There's no intuition involved. I'm just using the facts and knowledge I already have to come to a conclusion.
Yeah, you're not evaluating anything specific with that case. You have a starting point based on your own rational thoughts, your own cognitive faculties, your own 5 senses. That's kind of what we're getting at. I mean, another intuition would be like, just simply that, I'm conscious or you're conscious. It would be kind of weird for you to think I'm a pea zombie, that I'm maybe not a conscious person. It seems reasonable to conclude we're all conscious people just from the get-go.
Wouldn't that be more of an axiom, like an assumption, instead of an intuition? Like, you have to kind of assume that you would exist in order to.
They're similar. I mean, they're very similar in sort of that thing. I mean, you can they can be quite interchangeable in conversation. So they're very similar in that sort of thing. But let's try to get back on topic, because I think I kind of pulled this off a little too much.
Yeah.
When we're talking about moral realism, most people, I mean, pretty much all people, except if there's someone like a sociopath or someone who's mentally deranged, will basically start with the idea that there are certain things that are objectively wrong, that we ought to, bring justice upon, that we ought not to do, that we ought to enforce or not. And so then the anti-realist comes along and says, no, that's not really what's going on here. It's non-cognitive states. It's just relative to culture. There really just is no of these facts. And so then, as Richard Boyd, Kevin DeLapp, Ruth Schaefer-Lindo, Thomas Nagel, all of these people who are not theists in any way, will say, well, okay, but that's still our intuitive starting point. The anti-realist has to mount a case for their position in order to overturn the starting point.
I don't agree with your assessment there that most people believe in morals being objective. Where did you get that number from? Like, where would you even measure that at?
Well, you don't measure things in philosophy. That's a scientific idea.
Well, you said most people believe that in objective morality. So where would you get that number that most people believe in objective morality?
It's an assumption or an intuition.
Oh, you don't know, just assuming it.
Yeah, it's an
okay, I can assume any position I like, but that doesn't actually make it true.
No, it doesn't necessarily make it true, but it is an intuitive starting point.
Well, sure, you can intuit and believe that that's the case, but that's not really an argument. Like, that's just telling me once again that you believe that that's the case.
Okay,
right?
so then prove me wrong, though.
Why would I? It seems like I'm proving a negative there, aren't I? Like, you're the one holding a position that most people believe in objective morality. Why is the burden on me to prove that you're wrong in that situation?
Well, again, because we're starting with the basic intuition. The anti-realist comes along.
You're starting with that, and I don't agree with your assumption, your base assertion there.
So you think most cultures, most people assume that there are things that are not there, that right and wrong don't exist.
I think most people don't understand morality and philosophy.
So then, where do ideas of justice, oughts come from then?
I think we're taught it a lot of times. I think we're taught what justice is. Like, why? I think we're taught through culture and things like that. And then we're taught this terminology. I mean, some of it depends on your background. Like, I mean, if you're a religious person or you're someone who practices Christianity, you think that, justice comes from God and the Bible and things like that.
Well, so within society, so why would we? So the arguments basically is that moral facts and duties, whether they're relative to culture or they're non-cognitive states, they seem to manifest in reality through experience, through moral progress, moral convergence, as if they are objectively true. So we have this basic intuition. Hold on one second. We have this basic intuition, and it seems to suggest this. The anti-realist comes along and says, well, no, I don't think this is true. I think reality is different. The moral realist responds, well, look at how they manifest in reality. Look at how they sort of appear to be objective. It seems far more likely. So if I could give you a quick quote here, Richard Boyd says, in the sciences, we decide between theories on the basis of observations, which have an important degree of objectivity. It appears in moral reasoning. Moral intuitions play the same role which observations do in science. We test general moral principles and moral theories by seeing how their consequences conform or fail to conform to our moral intuitions about particular cases. So just because people may disagree, just because people may not necessarily know these things, when it comes to something like science, everyone assumes there is an objective world outside of our subjective minds. And so when it comes to things like moral realism or objective morality, moral realism versus anti-realism, that seems to be what most of the assumptions tend to be. That's why we have systems of justice. That's why we talk about moral progress, things being bad and good, things being oughts and ought-nots.
Well, I think, like, once again, I think the quote you used was just saying that the appearance of something, like, once again, just because to you it appears that this is objective morality manifesting itself within the world, that's just how you perceive it. It doesn't make it actually the case. Once again, it's just kind of appealing to your personal thoughts, your opinions, basically. And then as far as like this, like, especially with the was it moral progressivism or
moral progress?
Moral progress. Sorry, that's what I was looking for. I think that's just basically people using their own standard, right? Like, I could look at situations where I think it's what's a good example? I think it's immoral for us to throw people who smoke marijuana in prison, right? Is it actually immoral to throw people who smoke marijuana in prison? I don't see why there'd be a moral fact necessarily that says that. It's just somebody's opinion that we should throw somebody in prison because of that.
So is it your opinion that evolution is true?
I believe the scientists. Yeah, I trust the scientists. It's not my field of study. I definitely haven't done enough research on it, but I definitely do. The majority of scientists tend to believe that. Me
too. Is that just an opinion you have? Like, is there no facts behind that?
That I trust the scientists?
Well, that evolution is true. So you say that,
I'm just saying I trust what the scientists say. I haven't done enough research to give you an answer on that.
Okay, yeah, but okay. So let me give you something simpler. Is it just your opinion that the Earth is round?
No, I mean, we can measure that. There's stuff that's measurable through science with that. But I don't think that works with morality. You can't measure morality.
Well, I mean, you can't measure a lot of things. Like, for example, if I were to ask you how many ants there are on the planet, obviously there's an objective number, but we can't just go out and find that. So measuring something is not necessarily deciding if something's true or not.
Totally agree.
So, I mean, so if you're saying that they're just opinions, I mean, yeah, sure, it happens as on our subjective conscious thoughts, but so does science. We have to do science through subjectivity. So why would, if it's just in our conscious thoughts, why would that apply to morality and make it subjective and not to science?
Because we're talking about things you can measure within science. I think they're two different topics altogether. I think when you're talking about morality, especially you're talking about something that's independent of human mind somehow, which I don't quite understand how, when it tends to be with morality that I see, it's directly related to human beings. Well,
I mean, there are philosophers out there who are scientific anti-realists, even.
Sure.
And there are people that say science is a social construct.
Yeah.
So You know, is that enough to show that science is just subjective, just because some people say?
Look, I'm like I said, I'm happy. Like, I'm not someone who's trying to completely take down moral realism, right? But like, I'm just looking for the evidence of it. So, like, I mean, if you have an argument for moral realism, I'm happy to go through that argument with you, go point by point and kind of see what it is. I think when we get to the moral ontology of it, though, that's where I think a lot of it falls apart, especially for Christians in general, because of all the contradictions built in within that.
We're not necessarily there yet, but
no, I agree.
So, if I asked you to prove to me that your cognitive faculties work, could you?
What would be the standard that I could show you that they work?
You can't measure them, so.
So could I prove it to you though? My cognitive faculties work.
Could you measure it? Could you show me with evidence?
Well, I think you would have some kind of standard, right? You would be the one who decides that my cognitive functions are working properly. I might have my own standard. You might have a different standard. So depending on your standard, I think I could show it to you. Sure.
Okay, so what standard would you use then?
My own to prove you. It would really be more about your standard. Like for me to know that my cognitive functions are working, to me, like for my self-knowledge, I mean, I could have it go to a doctor, have them test some of the cognitive functions. I could have them do like an eye check.
Well, I'm talking about cognitive faculties. These are mental states, you know, reasoning, logic.
Yeah, like if my brain is working properly, basically.
Right.
These are all functions of my. Yeah, you could have a doctor check your brain to see if it's working properly.
I mean, you could do that with flat earthers, and their brains are probably working properly. We don't think their cognitive faculties are working properly, I guess.
But you couldn't do that with morality. You couldn't go to a doctor and have them check to see, you know, if morality is real. Like I could check to see if my brain is functioning properly by going to a doctor and having them use equipment, stuff that's not even their mind. They could actually use machines that don't have minds to verify the information.
Just checking brains. They're not necessarily checking, you know, mental states. I mean, they're just checking to see if the brain activity is proper. So what I'm trying to get at, though,
well, you were talking about your senses, though. That's what you were referring to.
Cognitive faculties, not cognitive. Not senses.
Well, what would be the difference then? What would be a faculty? Like,
I'm just talking about, you know, things you use to like do reason and logic with inside your brain or inside your mind. You
would admit like doctors could do some form of test to kind of see if things are properly functioning. Because I mean, they've got to do it with people who have brain damage and things like that.
Yeah, they'll look at the brain necessarily, but what I'm talking about is cognitive faculties. I mean, only you in your conscious state can know they're working properly. So, I mean, you don't know if you're a butterfly dreaming you're a man. You don't know if you're a brain in a vat type thing. You assume that they're telling you truly that there's an external world out there outside of your subjective experience. And, you know, if you go to a doctor to get it tested, that could all just be happening inside your subjective experience. So what I'm just trying to get at, though, because I don't want to get too off track with this, is that you seem to be saying that, you know, I have to somehow show that these things actually exist. And the only thing I've gotten so far is that we should be able to measure it like we do in science. When in reality, you know, we sort of start with our intuitions with regards to that we're conscious, that we have cognitive faculties, that we're able to even do science. I mean, science has to start with philosophy of science. Scientific method comes out of philosophy of science and whatnot. So we have to assume these things are working to begin with. And so if my cognitive faculties are telling me that there really are moral facts and duties, there really are these things, objective things that are independent of me, I don't just get to make them up. Like I can change my taste preferences, or I can change my favorite movie or anything like that. I mean, why would we then therefore assume that they're like that if they're manifesting in reality an objective sense that requires justice, that brings about moral convergence and moral progress? Why ought we doubt our moral intuitions when they're manifesting in a way that appears to be objective?
I don't agree with you. I don't think they are manifesting in a way that they're objective, and I don't think they're doing it in a way that there's moral progress either.
Okay, so then how do they manifest then?
I don't know how they manifest to you. You're the one with that position.
Are you an epistemic skeptic?
Huh?
Are you an epistemic skeptic?
I don't know what that means. Epistemic.
I mean, it's
skeptic
sort of like I can't have knowledge. It's sort of like I just can't have knowledge. I can't know.
No, I think you can know things. Sure.
Okay, so then we can at least reasonably conclude that, you know, we are sort of on the same. We both have human brains. We're both on the same.
Yeah. I'm talking about specifically morality, though, and your claim that there are moral facts and they are there regardless of human minds existing.
So you don't think you have moral intuitions that things are actually evil and good?
No, I think I have morality built on emotions and my experience, but mostly emotions and empathy.
So
I don't have to intuit I don't know if I'd use the word intuition.
So okay, so then basically you have emotions or feelings. Mm-hmm. So if you were to, you know, see someone being tortured, you'd want to stop it just based on your feelings, though.
Sure.
So then you are aware of like something like the Freech-Gandhi problem then, right?
I'm not. Please explain it.
Okay, well, whenever my video on non-cognitivism.
Yeah, I watched a lot of videos today. I'm sorry, man. I may not remember all of them.
Okay, so you would say that something like I don't, you know, it's wrong. If I said it's wrong to murder, you would say that's a non-cognitive state, right?
What do you mean non-cognitive state?
Well, you said you're kind of leaning towards the idea they're emotions or feelings. So
yeah, I'm not. I'm kind of on the fence. Like I said, I'm still kind of really at the place where I think that it's more moral subjectivism. But I think
see, that's what I'm trying to. I'm trying to get your position because you're trying to argue that I'm wrong, but you're not giving me a better alternative to argue for.
I'm not really. All I'm doing is countering your points. I asked you to make an argument for it, and I haven't quite heard that argument. Besides saying that you believe in intuition, and intuition tells you that there are moral facts. But that's the most I've heard of your argument so far.
Again, I started with intuitions. I started arguing from atheistic philosophers that started that. I gave moral progress, moral convergence, the way they actually manifest in reality. And you're saying, no, that's not. And I want to know the better alternative.
Well, the problem is you've just made assertions. Like there hasn't been an actual argument. You just said intuitions. Then you said the way they manifest in reality, which I don't grant you that. You talked about moral progress, which I don't grant you that. So like, I don't know where the argument is. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just simply trying to counter your points. Like I said, I'm open to change my mind. I just want to hear the argument that proves that moral facts exist.
Okay, so what's the issue with moral progress then?
Because basically, if I were to say things are getting better, it's basically just pure like based on a standard that I have subjectively through my emotions and opinions created. Okay, so like you're when you say moral progress, you're appealing to some kind of standard. Like ultimate standard, and the progress is as morality evolves in our cultures. I don't know, this might be the best word to use there, but as morality changes, it's getting more towards that ultimate goal, that standard, right? But and that ultimately that standard is going to be God for you as a Christian. But I know we're not quite there yet.
So you say there really is no standard. So then why is it? So then would you agree that like society is better off without crucifixion, without rape?
It's my opinion that society would be better if there was no rape or crucifixion.
So why would society be better without rape?
People wouldn't be harmed and hurt.
Is harm necessarily a bad thing then?
It's my opinion that it's bad, yeah. And I feel empathy. I feel empathy for people who are harmed. So therefore, I don't want them to be harmed.
So basically, you're non-cognitive then. It's just your feelings then.
I think I said I lean a little bit that way. I do.
Okay, then let's get back to the Freech-Gandhi problem because you kind of jumped off of that and then you went back. And so if I said it's wrong to murder, you would say that can't be true or false.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a moral statements are just opinions, basically.
Okay. So if I asked you, is it wrong to murder? Is that true or false?
It's my opinion that murdering is wrong.
Well, it's not your opinion because opinions can be true or false. It's your feeling.
Well, opinions can't be true or false.
Sure, they can.
Okay, so
I can have the opinion that Easter is the best holiday.
But the fact of the matter would be that it's your favorite holiday. The opinion isn't true or false. Like Easter being the best holiday isn't true or false.
What if I have an opinion 2 + 2 = 4?
That's not an opinion.
Well, it's an opinion about a fact.
Well, is it a fact or an opinion? We do admit that facts and opinions are different things, right?
Yeah, there are different things.
Okay,
but
so
I mean,
that would be
you can have opinions that could turn out to be true is what I'm saying.
Sure, but you would know when you tell me 1 + 1 = 2. Yeah, it could be your opinion 1 + 1 = 2 if you don't know the answer to it. So opinions could turn out to be right, I guess, to some degree. But when we're talking about what we're talking about in moral subjectivism, it's not the same thing.
You mean non-cognitivism?
Sure.
So when I say I don't like, or when I say killing is wrong, that's just a feeling I have. It's kind of different than an opinion. Non-cognitivists don't use the word opinions. They say prescription or emotion, things like this. So if I were to say, let's say I worded it differently. If I just asked you, if I said it like an if-then, if I said, if Robin Hood steals, then it's wrong. Can that be true or false?
I'll stick, you know what, just for the sake of this argument, because that we're not, confusing it before moral subjectivism, non-cognitivism. I'll stay with non-cognitivism and say that I said that moral statements can't be true or false, just emotions. Yeah.
But I didn't actually make a moral statement there.
Say it again. Say your statement again.
If I said, if killing is wrong, then it's wrong for you to kill.
Okay.
So that's not a moral statement.
Okay.
But that can be true or false. So the Freach-Gandhi problem notes that the problem with non-cognitivism is that you change from non-cognitive to non-cognitive states within the same linguistic usage of terms. So moral statements within one context can be true or false, but in other contexts, when they're just claims, can't be true or false. And that just seems completely ridiculous. It seems absurd that they would just change from cognitive to non-cognitive states.
Okay. I was still kind of waiting for that argument you were going to make.
Well, I'm just arguing.
It seems like we tried to kind of escape making an argument here. We went right back to my worldview when I've asked you like 2 or 3 times to actually make an argument for moral facts existing. And it seems like you're just trying to attack, like I said, a position that I don't even hold strongly. I'm still on the fence with it. Right. I'm not going to die on that hill for non-cognitivism, but I really just want to know how moral facts exist besides just saying intuitive.
But let's recap here. Okay, so I said moral realism is true. It's intuitive. You said, I don't trust that intuition. And I said, well, what about moral progress, convergence? You said, I don't think that really is. I think these are just feelings. I gave the Freach-Gandhi problem, feelings, this sort of creates an absurdity here. So we're back to moral progress. And if the Freach-Gandhi problem shows that they're not just feelings, then what's wrong with moral progress if we're going to recap back to that main point then now?
So I don't understand what you mean here. What do you mean? So if we're talking about what's your argument on progress then? What's the moral progress argument that you're making?
Okay, well, the argument for moral progress is quite simple, is that over time we learn better, like we do with science. There's progress in science. We're learning more about the natural world. We're getting a better understanding of it. We're close to getting a theory of quantum gravity, which would be amazing. I can't wait for. Same idea within morality. The more we do moral reasoning, the more we study moral actions, moral experience, the more we better understand how morality is, these oughts that we're supposed to conform to. So like today, child trafficking, thank God, is now a horrendous crime. 2,000 years ago, it was just everyday business in the Roman Empire. They conquered people. They would just enslave everyone, including the children. So we are now learning over time what is better, what we ought to do, what is more wrong, what is right. We don't just look at the Roman Empire and go, well, that was just their opinion, or that was just how they felt about it. We're more or less like, that is wrong, that would be punished in today. Thank God it is, and it should be punished today.
Well, that's the way you view it, not we. I don't know. It's not everybody believes that. But I would say, hold on, what's the standard you're appealing to then? What's the standard?
Fair, society does operate on this idea that it is wrong, though.
No, that's your assertion and claim that you haven't backed up yet. So I want to know, what's the standard you're appealing to when you say things are getting better?
Okay, well, I'm appealing to the actual moral standards that we're slowly discovering.
Okay, and what are those?
Okay, well, depending on your normative stance, it could be different.
Please, yeah. What's your position?
I'm a virtue ethicist.
Okay, so explain it. So what is the standard of morality that you're referring to that it's getting better? So what is that standard? So
things like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, these are virtues we ought to try to obtain. We ought to try to do these things, exemplify them, present them out. This is Aristotelian virtue ethics. There are certain virtues of goodness we ought to obtain. So those virtues are your standard? Yeah. I guess you could say something like that, perhaps. Okay. So not your standard isn't God. Well, see, I'm equating those, though. So we'll get to the moral argument. I'll point that out. But you would say your standard is ultimately God, though, right? Well, you're basically using descriptions of God by saying virtuous and things like that. As long as we define it the same way, though. Okay. Yeah, you're talking about God's very nature, basically being a certain way, and those words you just used basically describe God's nature. Yeah, I mean, you could say like that. I don't like to word it like that, though, because I think it creates confusion. Okay. So the things that what I would say then, the problem with your moral progress argument is that these things that you would argue that we've gotten better on, like slavery, or things like that. You even mentioned child trafficking. These are all things that are perfectly moral and condoned by God in the Bible, your very basis of morality. Okay, so, well, I mean, we're not arguing Christianity today. So sure. I'm just arguing at your actual position, though. I don't think we can leave that out because your foundation is that God is the true nature. The moral facts, his very being, is the very moral facts you're appealing to. Yeah, but fair to leave that out. For one thing, it is commonly, I'll jump on this really briefly, but I'd like to stay on the actual topic. For one thing, this is commonly misunderstood if you talk to a lot of ancient Near Eastern scholars, like, for example, someone like Dilbert Hillers, for example, or someone like John Walton, is that we think of these like modern law codes. In reality, someone like Dilbert Hiller notes they're didactic, they're exhortational. They're not meant to be prescriptive. They're expressing the moral importance of something. So when they say these certain things, we're interpreting in terms of our modern law code. Even someone like Christine Hayes, who's at Yale University, who's not a Christian, will note, we have no evidence these were used in law courts. We don't even think they were. John Walton refers to them as treatises on judicial wisdom. They're commonly misunderstood, commonly taken out of context, and we need to understand them in the ancient Near Eastern context.
Sure.
So,
like, if your argument is what the Bible says isn't true, what it actually is written there,
that's not what I said.
Well, okay, well then, what the Bible says, which is the book where Christians get their information from, says that you can own child slaves, foreign slaves, keep them for life, treat them as property. Very things like, if I were to ask you, is it morally good to keep a human being and own them as property? Is that a morally good thing?
Well, it depends on how they defined property. It depends on how they defined slavery back then. So, for example, Exodus 21:16 outlaws any form of antebellum slavery. You cannot kidnap someone from their land and force them into slavery. I mean, the actual word for slave is multiple meanings in the Old Testament. And in fact, the Old Testament talks about there's certain cities slaves can run to if they want to leave their master. That's not property, because in something like the Code of Hammurabi, they can't. If you're harboring a runaway slave, if you give them back as their property. In the Levitical law, they're not property. If they run away, you have to harbor them and keep them safe. But then again, as I said, these are treatises on judicial wisdom. These were not minimal sentences or laws that we would be interpreted as today, like modern law codes. So, for example, Dilbert Hiller says, there is no evidence that any collection of Near Eastern laws function as written codes that was applied by a strict method of exegesis to individual cases. As far as we can tell, these bodies of laws served educational purposes and gave expression to what was regarded as just in typical cases, but they left considerable latitude to local courts for determining the rights in individual suits.
Well, like I said, I think you're incorrect in what the Bible says, because the Bible straight up, it does, they capture women all the time. It tells you can capture the women multiple times throughout Scripture after you've killed all the men and the children and things like that.
I think you're referring to Numbers 31, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about that.
There's a lot of Scripture where women were just basically treated as human property in those times by that culture.
Well, what did Jesus say about that?
I don't remember. Gee, I know there are other New Testament authors like
Jesus referring to the law of divorce, for example. He says this law was given because your hearts were hardened. That implies a lot of the laws that God gave were not necessarily what he wanted, but they were given as sort of like their hearts were hardened type thing. It wasn't a final thing. It wasn't meant to be thing. It was just, that's where humanity was. And that relates back to our actual conversation, moral progress. God was moving them along towards a moral progress. When Jesus came, he says, this was not the way it's supposed to be, but your hearts were hardened and we had to slowly get you to a better point. So that relates back to our actual conversation.
That kind of gets God a little impotent there, though. I would say that if he has to do things in a way to where he still allows human beings to own slaves and child slavery and treat women as property.
That's what's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, Leviticus 25 verses 44 through 46 clearly articulate the difference between Hebrew slavery, which is indentured servitude, and owning foreign slaves, which instead you could own people, keep them for life, pass them on to your children as permanent inheritance, treat them with rigor. You could purchase the children of those slaves. And also, just to be clear, I mean, it's not like in the New Testament they got rid of slavery. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 1 and 2 talks about how Christians who are slaves should give their masters full respect so that the name of God and his teachings will not be shamed. If your master is a Christian, there's no excuse for being disrespectful. So it's not
Roman slavery was a lot different than like antebellum slavery. People put themselves in that a lot of times. And again, you're interpreting this as if they're modern law codes. People like John Walton, Dilbert Hillers, Bruce Wells, Jay Botero, I mean, they're all noting that this has just been commonly misunderstood. These are not minimal sentences. You're looking at this from sort of like a Western perspective on that. But again, if you want to check out a more video on this, I believe JMB Apologetics or Mr. Bass just did a video on this over the summer, and they go into that more detail. But let's try to get back on topic.
But just to be clear, though, God gave the Levitical laws to Moses. This is God giving him these laws to his society. I mean, the very first paragraph of the chapter straight up says that these are the laws I want you to give to my people.
God gave them treaties on judicial wisdom, yes.
But that included child slavery and included treating women as property and all kinds of other things, killing.
Well, I've already addressed the stuff property like that. Yeah, but we can talk about that some other time.
That's fair enough. But I just want to point that out, that it will, when you get into ontology, these things, like when you argue about moral progress, just doesn't work. Well,
I'm not arguing for the Christian God at this point. My argument the argument I've given for moral realism has just been based on what I've read via Thomas Nagel, Ruth Schaefer Landau. These are atheists.
Sure.
So bringing up the Christian God is completely irrelevant.
I think it's funny, though, as a Christian, you have to argue atheist positions in order to try to, have a debate, right?
No, I do it I do it on purpose.
I know, because it's a tactic, and I'm not knocking you for it. It's a smart tactic, to be honest with you, put you in a better position. But this is kind of when we were setting up this debate, why I thought it was so important that we argue from our own positions and not argue other ones. Because I don't know, it just kind of seems like it loses the meaning a little bit.
In metaethics, my position is moral realism. It's independent of Christianity. For example, ideal observer theory, which is a moral subjectivist view, could be true, and is Christian, and that could just be what Christianity is. So Christianity is not necessarily tied to moral realism.
No, but that's what your position is, though.
Yeah, it's moral realism. Yeah,
because of Christianity.
If we were arguing evolution, and I was arguing as a structuralist, and you were arguing as a neo-Darwinist, I mean, we wouldn't bring Christianity up because that's a completely different subject. We're in metaethics right now.
I'm just trying to keep it within the realm of your actual beliefs. Because I think that's a much more interesting conversation than arguing something that you don't necessarily believe.
We've got 10 minutes.
All right, sorry, go ahead. Let's keep going.
You got 10.5 minutes or less. Just for the sake of keeping it within the realm of moral realism, as it was, you could say, advertised. A debate on biblical ethics would be fine another time. If you guys want to continue on it, I mean, I don't want to be.
No, that's fair enough. Let's go back to
it. Determine the conversation, but I think if we return to the original arguments on moral realism, we have 10 minutes left before we move on to the moral argument.
I think that's fair. Let's go back, James. All right, let's go. Maybe we can hear that actual argument then.
Okay. Well, I've given arguments several times, and your only response is, "I don't believe you. I think differently." Well, okay. Well, possibility is not probability.
I mean, just telling me that it's intuitive isn't an argument.
No, it's a starting point, and then the argument then needs to be: is there something better than our intuitive starting point? Like when I argue for B theory of time, I have to actually mount an argument. I just can't say, "No, I reject that intuition, therefore I win." You actually have to give an argument.
But you would agree, though, that even if I couldn't make a good argument against that, right, that doesn't make you right. Like, so me having to put up an argument to show why that's not the best, why there isn't a better way to look at it, doesn't actually make you right.
No, it makes it more probable. If you can't mount an argument against the basic starting point, why would I change my view? Why would we then think something else is true?
Well, you can absolutely keep your view. That's not a problem at all. I'm not going to argue against that. You should keep whatever view you have. But it's just not a very convincing argument to say that I feel that morals are real and objective. Like, that's what I hear when you're saying it. Like, I'm trying to look at if I were looking at reality, how would I look and know that there are moral facts regardless of human beings existed or not?
Given what you just went on about the God of the Old Testament, I mean, you're trying to argue that we ought to reject this God because look how evil he is. That seems to be arguing from an intuitive standpoint that we ought to objectively reject this God. If it was all subjective or all just feelings, why could we criticize Christianity on that?
Oh, no. I'm just using it to show I use his own standard. I'm doing an internal critique to show what his standard of morality is, to show you why it's incoherent. Like, just saying that God of the Old Testament's a bad guy is a weak argument, right? Like, it'd just be giving you my opinion that he's a bad guy. I'm showing you by stepping into your worldview and showing you that, like, you're saying this is a moral fact that whatever slavery, that's why I brought the slavery issue, is wrong. But then you have instances where God condones it.
Well, I already agreed with you. Christianity is not tied to moral realism.
I agree, but you're a Christian and that's your foundation.
Well, I already agree with you. Christianity is not necessarily tied to moral realism. I think it makes sense on it.
Well, I agree with you multiple times that I agree that is not necessarily. But I'm arguing against your position.
Okay, well, my position, once again, let's say the fundamentalists are right and something like perfect observer theory is true. And then God just gives us commands arbitrarily. There's no real moral realism there. Maybe opiate theism is true. He's bound by time and all these sorts of things. First, before we even can do metaphysics, we got to establish our metaethics. And what you're talking about, arguing against the idea of the Christian God in the Old Testament, that's a metaphysical question because that's based in theology. That's based on an understanding of history. But we first have to establish our moral realism, our metaethics. So if I agreed with you right here that moral realism is false, I mean, why would you bring up certain arguments against God of the Old Testament then? Because there'd be no reason to dismiss him on that. He's just doing what his feelings are. Maybe he's got a better observation than we do, and he's doing the right, and he's doing the most pragmatic feelings. We can't say right if moral realism is false.
Yeah, but you're not making that argument that moral realism is false. That's true, and I just want to simply see how I could look at society or look and find that these moral facts exist. regardless of human minds existence.
Okay. Is there someone right now in the world doing something you think they should stop regardless of how they feel?
Regardless, yeah, there are things that I wish people wouldn't do, yeah.
Okay, so then perhaps that implies that there is some sort of other standard out there beyond feelings that people ought to abide by. If you say, if you're a cognitivist, then people should just do what they feel. I mean, why should we go on anything other than feelings?
I don't know how that would, simply saying that I want somebody to stop doing something, I don't know how that gets you anywhere.
Well, think of it like in terms of science. Is there someone right now who thinks the earth is flat? Yeah. Should they stop thinking that? You and I would agree, because it's objectively wrong to think that. The same sort of logic applies with moral realism. If you agree with me, there's people in the world right now doing things they should stop regardless of what they feel, then that sort of follows along the same logic.
Well, no, the problem is we accept certain things within science because we kind of have certain assumptions, but
exactly.
Yeah, but there are things that we can, there are objective facts to science, opposed to simply just claiming that there are objective facts to morality, basically.
Well, then I could just say you're claiming there aren't objective moral facts, and we're basically just talking past one another.
Well,
I mean, if you're just going to say I'm just claiming that, I can just turn around and say, well, you're just claiming there aren't. Therefore, we're not getting anywhere.
Well, I'm not claiming that there aren't. I'm just saying I haven't seen any evidence for it.
Okay, once again.
So I'm just asking for some evidence besides just basically asserting it. And I don't know, almost begging the question is just assuming that there are objective morals that exist. Like, I just don't see how that's a good argument.
Okay, once again, we're kind of going in circles now, but I'll just say it one more time. We go with our intuitive starting point. Again, like, for example, with A theory and B theory of time. I think B theory of time is true. It'd be absurd for me just to argue, no, I think you just can't assume A theory, therefore you need a burden of proof, you need to prove your point. No, that'd be an absurd way to argue. I actually have to give evidence, because I just can't go against the intuitive starting point without actually evidence. So then when that sort of thing sort of starts to happen, starts to unfold, I present a case, I start to build that up. And if I can't build a good case, if I don't even have a case, which seems to be what we've kind of unveiled here, then why would I reject the intuitive starting point? Because possibility, just a mere possibility, is not probability that these facts, that these things that we intuitively sense are wrong. Why should we direct our intuitions on this if there's no good reason to reject them? And again, it's not about proving right. It's not about demonstrating beyond reasonable doubt. It's just the most probable and the best explanation up until someone like a non-cognitivist or a relativist has a better explanation.
But I think the issue is once again, I'd like to kind of go back to the actual definition of intuition, because that wasn't given. You just gave me examples of intuition. Maybe that would help move the conversation along. But when you say you intuitively know something, you know that killing is wrong or whatever, and moral X is wrong. Like, what does that mean? Intuition.
Okay, well, I mean, so quoting Ruche Ferlindo, he's got a great lecture on this. He says, intuition is not a belief, it's not a judgment, it's not a guess, not a hunch, not a supposition. It's not infallible either. I mean, so he admits that flat out. It's a conscious experiential state. So we start with these
conscious experiential state. That's what I want to understand.
Are you conscious right? Okay, are you conscious right now?
Yes. Okay.
Are you experiencing something right now?
Yes. Okay.
Is there any reason that you reject what you're consciously experiencing right now?
No, but I don't understand how that applies to what you're talking about within morality. So what are you experiencing when you say murder is wrong?
I'm experiencing that it's wrong, that we ought not to do that.
How are you experiencing it? How are you experiencing it? Like when you ask me that question, I'm experiencing by hearing your voice, looking at my computer monitor, all these things. So how are you experiencing when I ask you is murder wrong? How are you experiencing that it is wrong?
Right. Well, when we watch the news or we see someone murders or something, we ought to provide justice. We ought to bring them to justice. We ought to not do that. Follow their example. These sorts of experiences we have. So then the question is, if those experiences are wrong, why?
No, I don't understand. I don't know how you're using that word experience there. You just said now you're saying okay, so you watch a news report where somebody was murdered. All right, what about watching that news report? What about that experience tells you that murder is wrong?
Okay, well, again, it's about the whole experiential state. So if we see these sorts of moral behaviors happening, these sorts of things manifesting as they do, we tend to get certain prescriptions, certain states that we say oughts and not oughts. These are prescriptions or obligations that we certainly experience when we do these types of things. So again, going back to my example, you are conscious now, you're experiencing something.
Hold on, we're talking about an ought, though. How are you experiencing ought?
Okay, you ought to stop talking. You just experienced it.
No, okay. I heard your words that you said, but that doesn't actually. That's not the same thing as saying how do you experience an ought.
Okay, well you're making it. You're not making the epistemic distinction. You heard sound. But obviously there's an epistemic distinction between just sound and the actual words I'm making. We can't confuse the ink in the paper with the message on the paper.
Fair enough, but what is the experience you're talking about with an ought?
Okay, let's going back. You were asking me to define intuitions. I said it's a conscious experiential state.
Okay,
so
and I asked you what that
conscious
experience was. Okay, yes, I understand that. Okay, I'm conscious, and then you use the analogy of me hearing you or looking at the computer. But I don't know how that applies to morality.
Okay, let's first define intuitions, though. Okay, because I want to get on this then. Okay, so conscious experiential. What was that?
Got about a 2-minute warning.
No worries.
You have a conscious experience. Okay, you have an intuition that right now you're in the middle of a conversation via Google Hangouts.
I don't know if
that's your intuition.
It's based on no. It's not an intuition. It's based on facts of my reality. I'm not.
Intuitions can be based on.
I'm taking information, processing it through my brain, and coming to a conclusion. That's not intuition.
Through your 5 senses. What if you're having a dream right now?
I don't know if that would be intuition or not. But what we were talking about isn't intuition. What the first example you used.
Okay, so is it intuitive to think you're having a dream right now, or is it intuitive to think you're actually awake in the middle of an actual conversation?
You defined intuitive as having an experience.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so am I having the experience of dreaming right now? No.
Okay, so then that's a pretty good intuition to start with. Now, if you woke up and you went back to sleep and you're in the conversation, that would be a good reason to doubt it.
But that's not an intuition. That's a conclusion. You're coming to a conclusion based on facts and evidence. That's not an intuition. And let's just intuition, the ability to understand something immediately without the need of conscious reasoning. Like no, I'm reasoning. I'm looking at evidence. I'm coming to a conclusion. That is not a subconscious thing here.
It's not subconscious. So, for example, I said flat out, "Are you conscious? Are you experiencing something now?" Without reasoning, you said yes.
No. I did reason. I did reason
with additional reasons to back up to support your intuition.
No. I'm reasoning. I'm not. No. The problem is I'm reasoning. I am reasoning. It's the opposite of the definition. There's the need for conscious reasoning. I am consciously reasoning in this situation.
Yeah, you should. You start with intuition, then you go into reasoning.
If you're just defining intuition as you start with an experience, you have an experience.
Yeah,
that becomes so meaningless in what you're arguing. Yes,
everything
starts with an well. I mean, that's not. We wouldn't use the word intuition to just say we're having an experience. It's just not the terminology we would use in everyday life to say, hey, like you're never saying I'm having the best experience of my life. I'm having the best intuition of my life. Like that's just not how we use language.
Intuitions are about experience. So how would you define intuition then?
I like the definition here is good. The ability to understand something immediately without the need for conscious reasoning.
So you can understand you're having a conscious experience right now without reasoning it.
No. I am when you asked me a question was about something specific, right? So if you say like when you talk about morality, X is wrong, all right? When I'm talking about morality, I'm reasoning it. Like I'm like, well, I have empathy. I don't want to hurt other people. I don't like what it feels like when people hurt me.
Yes, exactly. But that comes after the basic intuition. You then go into reasoning. That's just the logical way that it sort of happens. You start with the intuition, then you reason about those things.
We're coming to a close in terms of that time range. I'm guessing that this discussion is that particular topic may come back up again as we are now changing gears. Doesn't have to. You guys can talk about whatever you want, of course, because there's more than one premise to the moral argument for God's existence. And I am very excited because this is a controversial argument. So I hate to change gears subtly, but at least it's in the ballpark of what we've been talking about. Broadly speaking, there's overlap. And so we are going to also ask people to just shoot your questions in the comments. It'll help me to see your comments, or I should say your questions. If you maybe do something like give me the @modern-day-hysteria, and that way it'll highlight as orange for me. It makes it a little bit easier when the comments are just firing through at rapid speeds to catch your questions and quick copy and paste them into a notepad. So without any further ado, we are now changing gears to now not just philosophy, but philosophy of religion in particular. So very excited. This is I just can't get over how I'm enjoying this so much. The ideas have been terrific. You guys have been respectful. And so for this next 45 minutes, we're going into an argument for God's existence. And like I said, I've already just been blown away by the depth and the interesting ideas that we've had. So without any more pause, we're going into the moral argument for God's existence. So given that inspiring philosophy is taking the assertive or the affirmative position in this debate or topic as well. We will let Inspiring Philosophy have the start. And again, it'll be an open dialogue format. So, Inspiring Philosophy, the floor is yours on the moral argument.
All right. Do you want me to give my moral argument then?
Absolutely.
Can I ask you, are we doing just a general God here, or are we using the Christian God, what you believe right now?
Well, the moral argument cannot get to the Christian God. We can only get to a general theistic God from the moral argument.
Okay, perfect. All right.
All right. So you want me to just present my moral argument then?
Please.
All right. So for this part of the discussion, we have to assume moral realism is true. If we can't get past that, we can't even have this conversation. Fair enough?
Well, yeah, I'm not going to agree moral realism is true.
Right. But you could say, like, if moral realism is true, then kind of the arguments.
Yeah, but then I don't know. It kind of defeats the whole purpose here. like if we're just going to say, yeah, of course, yeah. If you think, well, you know what? Go ahead. Let's go with it. I'll see where you're going with it. I'll see if I have any disagreements.
Premise one: morality is a rational enterprise. I think this conversation has kind of shown that it's not an empirical enterprise. We decipher, we study these things within rational thought. Premise two: moral realism is true, meaning moral facts and duties exist. Premise three: the moral problems and moral disagreements among humans is too much for us to assume moral facts and duties are grounded in a human source of rationality. So because our source of rationality seems to be humans in a lot of ways, we understand that if moral realism is true, they cannot be grounded in contingent beings that are constantly changing their minds and whatnot. There is no sort of necessary way to do that. Premise four: moral facts and duties are grounded in a necessary rational source. This follows from moral realism being true. There needs to be a necessary source that the objective facts can be grounded in, and because it's a rational enterprise, so a necessary rational source. Okay. Premise five: this source is what we call God. Obviously, if something rational would have to be sentient, the conclusion, therefore, God exists. So the basic argument is, if moral realism is true, these are moral prescriptions, moral obligations, moral ideals. These sorts of things are rational. They're involved within sentient conversations, conscious conversation. They can't be grounded in something like a natural source. They can't be grounded in sort of descriptions of reality. They're prescriptions, and prescriptions and obligations can only exist between agents. Therefore, it's far more likely that they're grounded in a necessary, rational, sentient source, who we call God. So we're not just arbitrarily grounding them in God. We're grounding them in what would necessarily follow from moral realism, a necessary, rational source whom we just title God. So the moral good, when I say the moral argument implies the existence of God, I'm not saying we just need God to ground it in there arbitrarily. I'm saying moral realism leads to a necessary rational source. Rational would imply a sentience. This is the source that we call God. So that's the basics of the argument. We can get into specifics of it if you'd like.
But under natural moral realism, this wouldn't work, right?
Correct.
So if someone was just to simply take a naturalistic moral realism position, then one of those premises, I guess, doesn't necessarily work out. Because
right.
it isn't required that God.
You would reject premise four.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I think yeah, with this argument, it's not really going to work well, because if we can't, I don't agree that obviously moral facts exist.
Well, right.
But so, like, I mean, yeah.
Right. I wouldn't use this argument on you, like, obviously.
Yeah. I was really kind of hoping more to get into your actual beliefs in the ontology of the Christian beliefs in God is really what I was kind of hoping to go with this kind of segment. I thought you were going to argue more from a Christian perspective, but I get it.
This is why I have two videos up on the moral argument. I have the moral argument, and is God the same as moral goodness? I have said numerous times on my channel, and I hate when atheists come on my channel and go, for any of the arguments I give for God's existence, and go, well, this doesn't prove the Christian God. Like, obviously, no one's claiming that. We're arguing natural theology, other than like the resurrection argument, argues for just a general theistic God. So all I'm basically saying, though, is you don't believe moral realism is true. Could you at least say that it's probable or it's likely? If moral realism is true, the moral ontology would infer a necessary rational source.
I would have to know, well, could it be true? Could just some generic God have morality rooted in his nature and give it out? I guess.
Well, notice, no, I didn't say that, because again, I hate when I hear that, because not from you, but from when theists say that. Yeah. So when you debated like a guy like a couple years ago, his name was like Josh, I think, or something.
Oh, Josh Brister, yeah.
On the moral argument, he did some video in his car. When like I hate hearing that, because I don't think that's really getting at what we're trying to argue. You're just sort of saying morality is grounded in God's nature. Okay, well, why? How does that conclusion follow? So that's why I followed like Linda Zagzibski's argument in this, and that we're trying to get to a necessary rational source from the moral ontology itself of moral realism. So I understand that, yeah, you could say that's my view, but I really don't like to word it that way or say it that way. And I'm sorry I'm talking a lot. I just want to be very clear on it. Because I feel like that doesn't really hit at what we're trying to get at. Sure, you could say that it's grounded in nature, but it seems to imply still just epistemic distinctions there, and I don't like that.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to do with all this, to be honest with you. It's really just not a something that interested in. I don't believe in moral realism, so like this kind of argument where I have to accept the premise.
Yeah, I know.
You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't really. I mean, I'd rather just talk about the Christian God and talk about, you know, why morality is rooted in his nature and why he seems to do so many contradictory things when it comes to morals in the Bible. I think that's a way more interesting thing, especially since like the majority of people in this country tend to be Christian, and I think a lot of the people I talk to, they're moral realists. That when they're grounding their philosophy, they're grounding the morals being grounded in God's very nature. It's incoherent at some point. Like, this is a God who, you know, like as I've listed already before, was pro-slavery, I mean, he's ordered people to kill babies. He's literally killed babies because of like the sins of their father. When you look at David in the Bible, he treats women. He tells people they can treat women as property.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Sure.
Would you say it would be wrong for me to give a weapon of mass destruction to a mass murderer who's going to kill millions of people?
You as a human being? Yes. Yeah. Sure.
Okay, then have you seen Avengers Infinity Wars?
I haven't, unfortunately.
Oh my! Oh.
I know. I'm sorry. I'm not a comic book guy. I apologize. I've been waiting to see it with my son because he watches comics, so I gotta.
Okay.
Get
well, I'll try to shy away from that then if you've not seen it. But everyone knows who's seen this knows that in the movie something like that happens, and it is the moral thing to do. It's the only thing they can do. So I think this kind of comes back against your argument there, that you're sort of assuming that the circumstances are always, you're sort of assuming sort of moral absolutism, moral universalism, that circumstances cannot change how moral realism functions. So circumstances do actually quite imply or are involved. You just can't say circumstances cannot affect what is the moral thing to do.
So you're saying there are contexts, if I use particular scriptures, where it would be moral to kill a healthy baby?
Well, I'm not sure about that necessarily example from a human standpoint. I mean, you wouldn't say for us to do that. But let's say we have a time machine. Should we kill Hitler?
I wouldn't, no.
So you would not kill Hitler and save 6 million people?
I wouldn't kill a baby, no.
Okay. So what if...
a time machine, there's a lot more I could do with a time machine that would involve killing a baby. But this is part of the argument, too, with God, is God is a God of unlimited capabilities, but yet over and over again in the Bible, he chooses methodologies that are very harmful to as long as they're not contradictory in his nature. I don't see why God couldn't do a different methodology. I don't think it's unreasonable or illogical to believe that. This is an all-powerful God that can split atoms and create universes as it's defined. So I imagine he could choose a different methodology that doesn't involve harming children.
Well, you're assuming that could work with free creatures. We're getting to like the problem of evil. And the argument is that, as Clay Jones has argued, that such a thing is just not possible if you're going to work with the freedom of creatures, the actual free will of creatures.
He overrides human beings' free will all the time in the Bible. It isn't like he follows human beings' free will.
Like what?
How about the Pharaoh turned his heart to stone?
Well,
how about I mean, there's a lot of situations. What he did to Job? Do you think it was Job's will? You probably don't take that literal. I don't think you probably take that story literal, I would imagine.
Well, I did a whole video on Job, okay, and I think there was a far more going on with the ancient Near Eastern context. But let's go back to Moses, for example. So, for example, you're arguing that he hardened his heart, right?
Sure.
Well, I mean, the first thing you see in Exodus 3 is not that, Pharaoh's heart can be hardened. It's that Pharaoh's not going to listen. And then God says, you know, I will harden his heart. And this also relates to what Paul says in Thessalonians. God gives them a delusion when they reject God. So God simply follows along and gives them the desires of their heart already. So Paul basically has answered this, saying that it's not so much that God does this, you know, because that's what they wanted to begin with.
So you're saying in situations in the Bible where God orders human beings to harm children, that he had to order human beings to harm children. There was not another way that he could have done it.
Where did he do that?
Oh, 1 Samuel 15 is one. David's baby, second Samuel was another one.
So what happened in 1 Samuel 15?
You can look at Genesis. I mean, there's multiple scriptures where he harms children.
What happened in 1 Samuel 15?
That's when he orders the Israelites to kill all the Amalekites.
So they were extinct after that point then, right?
No, there were still Amalekites throughout the world. But God specifically orders those people to kill babies.
Does he, though? Because I think you're misunderstanding of the ancient Near Eastern hyperbole. So, for example, Karen,
you don't believe the Bible is true, and that's fine. If you're saying that this part of the Bible where it says God ordered these people to do this, you don't believe that's actually God ordering that. That's fine. I'll move on. I don't have. Is that your position? You don't believe God actually ordered that?
Well, it's ancient Near Eastern hyperbole. It'd be like us saying like that the Pittsburgh Steelers just got slaughtered last weekend. Sure. Obviously, we don't think they actually were slaughtered. We're just using hyperbole. So Karen Rhea Najit, in her book Daily Life in Ancient Mesopotamia, says one of the most valuable spoils of battle was the people. In the third period, some tablets record long lists of women and children. Sometimes women and children were included as part of the general massacre, but usually they were taken back to Ur and became slaves. So it's just ancient Near Eastern hyperbole. You can see this with like Ramesses III or Ramesses II, or, you know, Egyptians always are exaggerating things. They obviously say, you know, like we wiped out everyone, left no one standing in the city that we conquered. And usually that's just ancient Near Eastern hyperbole. So someone like, for example, Paul Copan, John Walton, they've written books about this and explained this, that we're misunderstanding these passages within their ancient Near Eastern context.
Sure. So when it says, this is what the Lord of hosts says, I will punish Amalekite for what he did to Israel when he barred his way out of Egypt. Go now, attack Amalekite and deal with him and all under the ban. Do not spare him, but kill men, women, children, infants, oxen, and sheep, camels, and asses. So this is not God actually telling the person here to do this.
It's the same within the ancient Near Eastern context of hyperbole.
Just yes or no, direct yes or no. God
it's not a direct yes or no question. That's not a yes.
It is actually either God is telling these people specifically to do this, or he's not.
That's a false dichotomy. It can be hyperbole.
Okay, this is God talks in hyperbole, is what you're telling me? Yeah,
God can talk in all sorts of ways.
So
when Jesus says, I am the true vine, does he have to be taken literal?
So God takes what you're arguing is he's using the culture at the time and talking the way the culture does at this point. Okay, that's fine. But it's still, I don't see how. So you're basically, this isn't true then. He didn't actually want you to kill the babies. God didn't want them to go kill babies. That's what you're telling me.
Yeah, it's ancient Near Eastern hyperbole. This is John Walton wrote a whole book called The Lost World of Israel.
Actually God doing this, that's fine. I'm not going to have an argument again. What about when David's baby killed?
When God had David's baby killed? Yeah, that's basically understood within that God is simply just going to let natural processes take out.
Well, he made the baby sick, God.
Well, God made everything through nature, technically.
Well, he made the baby sick as a punishment for David.
He allowed the natural. It would be understood.
That's not what the scripture says.
Well, you're looking at a high context society from a low context society. So we're trying to interpret this within their ancient culture.
Should I read the scripture for us? I mean, should I do that?
I know what it says.
Okay, so it says that God punished David and killed his baby as a punishment. In fact, David suffered, and he made the baby suffer for 7 days, I believe. So God made a baby suffer for 7 days to punish the sins of the father.
Mm-hmm. So
and this is a moral thing to do.
Well, first of all, you're assuming flat out that somehow you're assuming that you have some sort of omniscient status beyond what God. So let's just say you're right here, for example.
It was just a question. I wasn't assuming anything. It was a question.
I have to go back to my example I've used earlier, even though you didn't see the movie. So sorry, I'm going to ruin this, but in Avengers Infinity Wars, Doctor Strange, as you know from the previews, looks into the future and sees 14 million possible scenarios. Only one they win in. And halfway through, towards the end of the movie, he ends up just giving one of the stones to Thanos. And then he goes off and he will or will not kill half the life in the universe. Did he do the moral thing in that?
According to my personal opinion, I mean, you're just asking like my opinion on this. Like,
Well,
I don't know how that's relevant to like what's going on. We're talking about an objective moral realism, the fact that it was moral for God to make a baby suffer for 7 days and die from a sickness because of the sins of the father.
Well, first of all, Christian Think Tank has a great article on this, but let's go back to the example. You're assuming that, so Dr. Strange probably caused millions and millions of people to suffer in pain. So is that the moral thing to do?
It's a movie. This is so irrelevant to
it's
my
an
question.
Analogy. We're talking about
I asked you a specific question.
And you're not letting me answer my actual frame.
I just like to know, is it moral of God to make a baby sick for 7 days, make a baby suffer in order to punish the sins of the father? Is that a moral action of God?
First of all, why is he doing that, though?
Doesn't matter. I'm just asking, is it moral? You could say yes or no. It's just yes or no, and then you can
not a yes or no question. You want to understand.
It's either moral or it's not, right? Is it moral or not moral?
You want to understand within the ancient culture. No, because it's a setup question.
Well, God's, first of all, whether the cultural morality is different from God's very nature. God's very nature is unchanging.
Okay, but doesn't God work with free creatures within their?
I don't know if that's your opinion or not. I don't know.
Okay, well, that is. If you're going to judge the Bible based on what the Bible says, Jesus says that he gave them laws based on the hardness of their heart.
So God goes against his own very nature to work with human beings. So God goes against his own very nature to work with human beings within their moral, their morality within their culture.
Who said he was? Who said that necessarily was?
We're talking about the Bible.
Okay,
we're talking about whether it is moral for God to make a baby suffer for 7 days and give it a sickness.
Is suffering inherently wrong?
And you're asking me questions instead of answering the question.
Well, I'm giving you rhetorical questions. I'm trying to throw the argument back.
Well, you're asking a moral subjectivist questions as if that has any relevance to it, right? Hold on. My opinion on any of this, any moral question you ask me has no relevance to whether the fact that it is moral to make a baby sick for 7 days and then let it die. Has nothing to do with it.
You're telling me you're a moral subjectivist, and you're saying that this is absolutely wrong. God shouldn't have done this.
I'm not saying it's that. I'm asking questions. Never did I say it was absolutely wrong to do that.
Okay, then what's the problem?
I just asked the question, and you haven't answered it.
Okay, so then what's the problem with it then?
You answer the question, and once again, now you're asking me the problem. You're going back to my subjective moralism and be like, hey, tell me about why in your moral subjectivism you find this wrong. When once again, that is not an actual answer to the question. My opinion has nothing to do with it. Whether it's a moral fact that God makes babies suffer for 7 days, and it's moral to do that by punishing the father, it has nothing to do with my opinions and my morals.
Okay, so are you going to let me answer now? So let's go into the actual culture of what's going on. Jesus once again said that certain laws were given because of the hardness of their heart. God will sometimes do things because their hearts were hardened, and he worked within that culture. So, for example, Christian Think Tank has an article regarding, like, for example, the killing of the firstborn. It's a polemic against the ancient culture. He's working within their actual culture to show how horrific it's come. So in that culture, in this collectivist culture, people were, of course, considered to be responsible for their families, for what certain family member did. They took responsibility regarding that. God is working within that culture to show, basically, if this culture is the way it is, this is how things are going to act. That's just a simple understanding of what's kind of going on here within the cultural context. There's much more going on with God's specific types of wills, regarding natural will, regarding his actual miraculous will, and things like this. So the idea that, that what's going on here is not somehow evil is, of course, assuming a lot of things regarding that. It's ignoring things like the context, the circumstances. It's ignoring, of course, things regarding the future, David's heart, where that child's going to go. If suffering is necessarily bad, sometimes suffering is sort of used or sort of caused sort of to bring goodness out of people. Like when I exercise, I'm obviously causing suffering, but I'm doing it so that I could bring about a better good. So you're, of course, assuming a whole lot about this, for which there is a whole lot more circumstances going in this. If you're going to bring up an issue of the problem of evil, which is what you're getting at, you have to remember a couple things, namely human nature, as I've just been going over. You need to remember God's omniscience, that he's able to see all possible futures and know how to bring about the best possible outcome. And then, of course, two more other important points, namely that we're not supposed to remember that this world is alone what's going to happen. There's supposed to be a resurrection where God's going to bring back everyone who wants to come back. And this idea that, so in this idea that, it's not that present suffering will have eternal meanings, as C.S. Lewis says, that God will turn every past suffering into a glory in the future. So you're of course presenting this as if it's like in its own like little tunnel, and you're ignoring the larger context with what else Scripture says, what else is promised, what is in the actual culture.
What I hear you saying is that God goes against his own nature to appease human beings by living within their cultural morality. So whatever example you want to use, whether it's killing babies, whether it's slavery, God's like, hey, he gives certain things and tells you straight up not to do it. You can't be gay. If you're gay or you commit sexual acts as a homosexual, you're going to get stoned to death in the Old Testament.
In a didactic law, not necessarily.
Well, like I'm saying, once again, the Bible says that God gave these laws to Moses to give to his people. So I'm just going by what the Scripture actually says.
Well, I'm going by what the Scripture says within the context.
So, like I said, you don't believe God told people to kill gay people at one point. Do you believe that, yes or no?
God gave them. You keep giving me these yes or no questions, and that's a false dichotomy.
It isn't a false dichotomy. He either did or didn't do it. I'm sorry.
He gave them a didactic exhortational law. So again, going back to what the scholars say, people like Dilbert Hillers, John Walton.
This is just like an appeal to authority over and over again. Like, like this scholar says this. Like, I'm arguing with you. Like, just talk. Like, use your arguments, man. I have not had to appeal to one philosopher or scholar one time this whole conversation.
That's a horrible decision to make. We should always appeal to experts.
Yeah, but the problem is like I have no reference to them, right? You're trying to convince me of something, and you're just randomly saying people that scholars, and I don't have a reference to go back and read it right now on the air and kind of have this conversation. So, like, it is a yes or no question whether God told people to kill gay people or he didn't tell them to kill. That is a true dichotomy. I'm sorry.
You don't have a reference because we weren't going to have this conversation. You just changed halfway through and made it this conversation. So what do you want me to do? I'm going to argue from what scholarship is on this issue because that's my position. I try to follow the experts. I try to follow the evidence. So I would listen to someone like Christine Hayes, who's got like a 20-some part series on the Hebrew Bible, and she knows these weren't even used in law courts. We don't think they were. So you're assuming that if they caught two guys having sex, that they're just going to be stoned flat out like that.
I just want to know whether God told people to kill gay people or not. That's all I want to know.
I'm pointing out that it's not that simple. He either
did or didn't do it. I don't know how it's not. If he didn't, you could say he didn't do that, and then you can give me an explanation why he didn't do that. No, you can say he did do that.
These are not yes or no questions.
I think the audience will disagree with you when they hear this because I think I've actually straight up many questions that are very much yes or no, true dichotomies. I don't understand. Like if I say my name is Skylar Fiction, I either didn't say my name was Skylar Fiction or I did say it was Skylar Fiction.
That's an actual dichotomy. That's an actual dichotomy.
All right. So
in cultural context, it's never that simple.
So, like I said, okay. So you're basically I don't know what your argument is at that point. My
argument is simply this: if you look at someone like Bruce Wells or John Walton or Dilbert Hillers, or Christine Hayes, even they're going to argue that this is a didactic law code. It's a treaty on judicial wisdom. They're expressing the moral importance of something. It's, I guess, the best analogy I could give for you in this system. It's sort of like saying, if you murder someone, it is if you should be murdered. That's a good way to sort of look at what they're trying to get at here. They're not necessarily describing minimal sentences, or if some of these topics were to come up, they're going to go look at the Levitical law and go, well, let's see what it says. Oh, here's your minimal sentence. We got to do that. I mean, a lot of times they could just pay their way out of it, and that's even mentioned. But in a high context society, you're not going to get that sort of things all the time.
So what's the moral importance of banning homosexuality?
Okay, one, in ancient culture, specifically under the Mosaic law, inheritance, passing the future on was very important for childbirth. You had to have children in these ancient cultures. Even under the Roman Empire, I mean, Augustus Caesar fined widows if they weren't married after 2 years. Because in these ancient cultures, children were so utterly important. They were your inheritance. They were your retirement program. They were continuing on the work. So the reason why this was banned within the Mosaic covenant is quite simple. They needed people. They needed people to constantly be procreating in order to keep continuing the culture, to keep it going on. Because in this ancient setting, you need as many people as you possibly can. It's unlike today's Western individualist cultures. We have enough technology. We're getting to the point where we're overpopulating the planet.
So is it your opinion that the laws that are laid out in Leviticus, including stuff like killing gay people, killing adulterers, were not actually practiced by the Hebrew culture?
We have no evidence that these were actually used in law courts, as Christine Hayes says.
Okay, so we don't know. So basically, we don't know if the Bible is correct in what it says, or if it isn't correct, because we just have no way of looking to see if these people were actually executed.
What you're still assuming a Western view of this text. I mean, if it's not within that context, it's not either that they did it or they didn't, or they either saw it in a certain way. You're assuming that these are sort of like law codes that have to be read in a certain way. Why? Why do they have to be read that way?
I'm just going by what it actually says, and it says to stone gay people. It says to kill adulterers. It says to kill disobedient children.
You're going on an English translation with a Western dictionary in your head, and you're ignoring the cultural context, the Hebraic context.
I do actually a show actually every week where we read the Bible, and I have a PhD, actually Digital Hammurabi, who's right here actually in the chat, who reads Hebrew, understands Greek. And we've gone over these verses before. There's no reason to believe that in the Hebrew, it's not actually saying to kill gays. Like, are you saying that in the Hebrew, it does not say that? It says something differently?
I'm saying it does say that, but you're ignoring the cultural context. It's people like John Walton have pointed out. I mean, John Walton wrote a whole book called Old Testament and Ancient Near Eastern Thought, that we have been misunderstanding these for a long time within the context of ancient law codes.
What part of the cultural context am I not understanding?
You're not understanding that these are basically understood to be didactic.
What is that? Explain didactic. What does that mean?
Okay, it's exhortational, not prescriptive.
Further elaborate.
Okay, they're expressing the moral importance of something, not giving minimal sentences, as I've said multiple times.
Okay, so they're just okay. And why is it okay? So it's morally important, and that moral comes from where? The Christian God.
The moral comes from the covenant established by the Christian God.
Yeah. So it's part of God's nature not to be gay, because it's morally important that you don't commit homosexual acts.
Well, God's not gay. I mean, God doesn't.
Not straight either. So
yeah.
So I mean, but why? So how would that have anything to do with his nature and it being the foundation?
Again, I told you there was the covenantal reasons within the culture itself. God gave more than just moral laws in the Old Covenant. I mean, for example, you can't sew fabrics. That's obviously not a moral commandment. It doesn't just contain moral commandments. There's obviously covenantal commandments, ceremonial commandments, these types of things.
Is disobeying your parents, is that a moral commandment?
It depends on the context. I'm not going to answer that as a virtue ethicist.
Mm-hmm. So like when it says if you could kill disobedient children, like that would be morally good to kill disobedient children in that context?
Is there any evidence these were used in law courts, or that they were meant to be understood that way?
That's fair enough. If you're basically making arguments that the Bible isn't true, and that kind of works out for me then.
Yeah, that's not what I'm saying at all.
And what the Bible actually says, and that's what it says. You're trying to make as if there's some kind of other interpretation of it that doesn't actually match what it reads.
Well, yeah, there's a scholarly interpretation of the Levitical law.
Mm-hmm. And there's scholars that disagree with you also. There's scholars that actually agree with my position that it is literally, I mean, this isn't too much of a stretch to understand that cultures back then didn't really dig gay people that often. I mean, they were doing all kinds of heinous things in those times.
Okay, the reason, of course, is why, though. Again, it has to do with the actual culture.
Because people are just confused. People are weird. Like, why did what was the Aztecs that used to sacrifice somebody every day in order for the sun to come up? Like, why did they do that? Who knows? I think that's what it was. I think that's why they had like so many dead bodies. They put them at the top of those Aztec temples, and they would sacrifice people because they thought the sun wouldn't come up, basically, if they did it. But this is like, why is blood? I mean, you can do anything. Why is a blood sacrifice required in the Old Testament? Like, why do these people believe that you had to kill an animal to atone sin with God?
Well, why don't you read some scholarship? John Walton has written about this.
Why does God require you to cut the skin off the tip of your penis, basically, at some point?
Well, that's quite easily explainable. Why don't you look at the context? For example,
why does God order people to cut the skin off their penis?
That was the sign of the Abrahamic covenant.
Okay, great. Yeah, that was the covenant God gave him to separate people. But why? Why was this the methodology? Why would he tell people to hurt yourself?
Okay, I'm just going to go off the logic of Christine Hayes here. Okay, so yeah, some of the laws do sound arbitrary, but they're arbitrary for a reason. If you want to make a distinct culture that's not going to mingle with other societies or cultures around them, you got to do some sorts of things that are really going to stand out, that are really going to make you distinct from the other people. So she talks about the food laws. Yeah, they are kind of arbitrary, but it's going to be really hard to be sort of blending in with all sorts of other cultures if you're doing these things, these certain rituals that are going to keep you distinct and separated out. So yeah, that's why a lot of these things were fulfilled in Christ. They're not necessarily moral commandments. They're universal. These are meant to be for the Mosaic covenant or the Abrahamic covenant to keep Israel a distinct nation. That was the whole point. Keep them a priestly nation distinct from the other things. And a lot of the things about this weird thing about rituals came out of, like, as I'm still going on with Christine Hayes says, they came out of this really sort of anti-Semitic 19th century where we just looked at these rituals as primitive. And nowadays scholars are looking at them in a little bit more different light. They're there for a reason. They're there because there's a lot of complexity going on there within the culture. A lot of importance is put onto these for these people. Yeah, they're symbols, but they're symbols for a reason. They're keeping people on track. They're keeping people to remind them of certain things about their God, their culture, their past. That's the whole point of these things. If you were going to have a symbol that was just like, every day I need to put a stamp on my hand, I mean, that's not going to really have any sort of long-lasting meaning, because it's simple. It doesn't cause anything. It doesn't cause me to stand out in any way. It's really going to have to impact me for a long time. Things like food laws or not sewing fabrics together, these things are going to actually cause distinctness, cause people to really be separated and really stand out and really make an impact.
Which is all completely unnecessary to achieve the goal that God's trying to achieve, which is Jesus coming about and salvation. But hold on. So when you look at, like, basically we're looking at now God's moral character is to make human beings hurt themselves and hurt their children by doing such a brutal, as an adult now, like I had my first son circumcised, I will never do that again. I was so ignorant on the issue. And now that I realize what a brutal act that actually is to basically hurt children or hurt adults. Like, God creates a situation in order to separate a group of people for some other reason that he could do a million different ways, basically, so Jesus has come about. It's just so unnecessary. It doesn't make any sense. And
you're assuming that you have a better understanding than an omniscient being, that you know the better way to come about. Well, if there's a better way to do it, what is the better way?
Everything's fixed. That's God.
Then you take away free will. You don't have agents anymore.
Listen, like I said, God overrides free will all the time. He kills people. He does all kinds of things. Like, you think it's somebody's free will they want to die? Like, you think it's a child's will that they want to be executed? Like, there's all kinds of things God overrides. He doesn't care. I mean, look at, I said, I don't know if you believe Job's literal or not, but if you do believe in Job, I mean, look what God did with the devil. He allowed the devil to do to Job.
Well, see my video on the book of Job. It's actually quite different. And I don't think the devil's actually in Job. That's
fine. Like I said, you take a different interpretation of it. But I don't even need that story. I could just look at all the other things in the Bible where God just decides. He doesn't let people live with it. Like, he tells people, I want to separate. He's making them basically circumcise them. Like, he's telling people, men with crushed testicles, they can't go to church. Like, that's in there.
Well, that's kind of what, considering in Acts, the eunuch on the road back to Ethiopia is baptized.
And once again, like I said, it's just God overrides free will all the time. It isn't necessary. Free will isn't necessarily for him to solve the problem. And so what? Like,
that doesn't override free will. I think you're confusing freedom and free will. So, like, for example, you could limit my freedom right now by chaining me in a room, and therefore I can't really use my free will that much. But he doesn't override free will. He just limits freedom certain times for certain purposes.
Define free will for me then. Maybe that's
free will is an ability. It's ability to make conscious decisions between different choices.
Beautiful. Can extremely mentally disabled people make choices?
No, because they have limited freedom. That doesn't mean they have free will.
So then disabled people don't have free will.
It's not. They have limited freedom. That doesn't mean they don't have free will.
Okay. Somebody who cannot make choices, someone who's brain damaged enough, was born in a way in which they cannot make choices. Would that person have free will?
If they're not conscious, they can't do things. And
well, they're alive, they're breathing, their heart's beating and stuff like that. Like, but their brain is so damaged that they're not able to make choices. Would that person have free will?
They would still have the ability. Yes, they just wouldn't have any freedom to exercise it.
What ability are you referring to?
The ability of free will. Free will is an ability, not a. And freedom is. Think of it like this: free will is like the car. Freedom is like the gas. So if everyone can have a car, but if there's no gas in it, you can't go anywhere.
Okay, so I need a definition. What is the definition of free will?
Free will is the conscious ability to make choices.
Okay. Conscious ability to make choices. Somebody who's extremely disabled would not have the conscious ability to make choices.
They would not have any freedom to use their free will. Yes.
No, they wouldn't have any conscious ability to make choices. The very definition that you just used. Somebody that was extremely disabled would not have a conscious ability to make choices.
If I have the ability to type on a computer but don't have a computer, does that mean I don't have the ability?
Different analogy. I'm asking specifically about the analogy that I put forth. Can somebody who is extremely mentally damaged, has mental brain damage, be able, and they can't make choices.
They can't make choices because they don't have any freedom.
They don't have free will the way you described it.
I said they could still have the ability, just not have any freedom.
Well, how would they have any ability if they had extreme brain damage?
Well, you can have an ability and not the
ability to do what?
Ability.
Ability to do what?
Okay, you can have the ability. Like if I have the ability to type but don't have a computer, I still have the ability,
but
even though I cannot actually exercise that ability.
You wouldn't have if you can't exercise the ability, you don't have the ability to type.
Yeah, sure I do. If you take
how do you have the if you physically don't have the ability to type, how would you have the ability to type?
You don't. You're confusing action and ability.
I'm asking some clear questions here, and it seems like you're moving away from the question. I think you know this. The problem is God makes babies and human beings in ways they don't have free will. They are born with extreme will. They don't have free will. They don't have the ability to make choices.
Yeah, they can't use their free will.
Making a distinction that is absolutely silly, to be frank.
Well, it's an important distinction for
it isn't. It doesn't. You're basically redefining someone who has no ability to make choices, has no ability because of the way that the condition their brain is, as if they have some kind of abilities, and they don't.
Well, they cannot exercise their abilities. I mean, they still have eyes. That doesn't mean they necessarily use their eyes.
Okay. If that's your argument, that's fine. I don't know what I can do with that. I mean, it seems so absolutely silly.
You're trying to argue that somehow God sorts of takes away free will from
because he does. There are people that don't have the ability to make choices.
Okay,
and those people are born like that, the way God made them.
Jesus says in John 9:41 and John 15:22, if I have not come, they would not be guilty. But because I've come, they no longer have an excuse. So people are not punished for lack of information or lack of ability.
We're not talking about punishment and ability. We were talking about something different. We were talking about free will, and you said you defined free will as the ability to make choices. And there are people who don't have the ability to make choices.
Okay, then they're not guilty.
It's not about being guilty. It has nothing to do with being guilty.
It's very much. You're relating it
to the situation that I'm talking about. I'm specifically arguing free will and the idea that God overrides free will. And when God makes people born with extremely debilitating brain damage, where they cannot function and make choices, they do not have free will. God is overriding their free will by the very way that he made them.
Okay, and then what's the consequence of that then?
What do you mean?
Okay, so then you're arguing that certain people are born handicapped. Does that mean that...
No, the point was that was one of the arguments you made earlier to defend your position. Was like, well, he can't override free will, and I'm just showing that he does it all the time.
Well, we're talking about humanity in general. And, are you suggesting it'd be better if everyone was born that way?
No, that's not. I was literally countering a particular point of yours when you were using free will as a justification for your viewpoint. That's why God can't come in and do things another way. So when I gave it a position like killing David's baby to making it suffer for 7 days and making it sick, he is overriding. Like that's the point. Is that? And then you were like, well, he can't do it another way because he'd be violating free will. Then I show you that he's violating free will by making human beings that don't have the ability to make choices.
You're assuming that applies to everyone, though. Sure, there are bad circumstances because of the natural world that we live in, that we've chosen to live in. I mean, an earthquake could happen right now and die, and I wouldn't be able to use my free will anymore because I'd be dead. But that's just a consequence of living in a natural world where we rejected God's lordship. That's going to happen. But you're trying to say that somehow God can override free will, therefore he can do it anytime he wants. Yeah, but he's got specific purposes if he's going to do certain things like that to bring about, or simply that's just a result of the natural world. That doesn't show that God is going to somehow do that and sort of just get rid of a free will for humanity altogether. When we're talking about things like the problem of evil, we're talking about free will on a general whole regarding all humanity.
So your position has now changed from God can't violate people's free will to God can violate people's free will. Sometimes.
My position was never God can't. My position was God can't if he wants to bring about certain things along with free creatures. We were talking about God. You're saying God could just fix everything by snapping.
He could, yes.
Yeah, but then he would remove all of free will for every humanity.
So
and we'd be biological robots.
No, we wouldn't be. No. You're talking about limiting abilities. Once again, and what is there free will in heaven? Like if I get to heaven, is there free will?
Sure there is. You've heard
so I can sin in heaven? I can sin in heaven?
Haven't you ever heard of the war in heaven?
I've heard Christians argue. But as for if I were to go to heaven when I die, I could sin in heaven.
Sure, but you wouldn't for the same reason you're not going to go eat dog poop right now.
Yes, but I could theoretically sin in heaven, even though it says sin can't be allowed in heaven. I believe in Revelations.
Okay, so what's the verse?
I'm going to look it up real quick. Because I am pretty sure it says
You're also referring to a very highly hyperbolic, metaphorical book that talks about all sorts of things regarding the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So you're talking about.
I just want to make sure you're not aware of this. Like about
Revelations is a highly hyperbolic, metaphorical book on purpose. Okay, the reason why there's not a lot of sin in heaven is for the simple reason that the same reason you're not going to go eat feces right now. You've learned to the point where that's a good thing. We have the free will to do it right now, but we're not going to do it, obviously, because it'd be a horrible thing to do. Sanctification, well, that point, it brought it to the point where we won't want to sin. Yeah, but the same book also mentions the war in heaven.
Sure. So then God can make us in a way that we wouldn't want to sin, but we would still have free will.
What do you think he's doing right now? That's what sanctification is.
No, but the problem is he violates free will. Once again,
how?
I gave you examples by making people who can't make choices by the way he designs them.
You're assuming
when they were in the womb. I mean, he makes horrifically handicapped people in the world.
Yeah, you're assuming that that's the way they're always going to be. If you're taking
that's the way they're always going to be.
If you're going to take all of Christian theology together, then when they die, they don't necessarily just go away. They would be given the same choice they would on a different plane of existence.
Sure, the ends justify the means, basically, is what you're arguing. That it's okay to make people like children with deformities and handicaps because in the end, they'll get to go to heaven.
So you're assuming that it's bad for the ends to justify the means. So
no, I'm just asking if that's your position. I didn't say anything about being good or bad.
Yeah, as a virtue ethicist, that the ends can very well justify the means in certain circumstances. So if I were to kill someone because they were about to kill my family, then yes, the ends just justified the means.
So in the situation of God making a baby sick for 7 days, David's baby, the ends justify the means. And
I already gave you the whole cultural context regarding the context with a Christian thought of the afterlife, the resurrection.
You don't answer a lot of questions directly is what I'm catching on to here, man. Well, I'm sorry. Like, I'm not trying to be rude, but like I've asked you so many questions directly and you just won't answer them.
Well, I'm not going to answer loaded questions that you're expecting a yes or no when that's a false dichotomy.
Not a false dichotomy. Either does or doesn't. Okay. I'm sorry. This is so basically there's so many things here. I don't know. Maybe if you got another question, go ahead. I don't know how far we've been going. I don't want to keep it going if I'm running over our time here.
Well, I mean,
I apologize if I am.
What I was trying to say earlier was, as everyone who's seen the Avengers movie knows, yes, sometimes the ends does have to justify the means. That's the whole point of the movie. It's really an unfortunate, sad circumstance, but everyone knows how it's going to end in the next movie. I mean, people aren't really that stupid. We know what is about to happen right before the movie ends. We know how it's going to end, and we no one accuses Doctor Strange of doing the bad thing there. We know he had to do the right thing. And if God wants to work with free creatures, I'll give you a couple quick points on the problem of evil. So,
3-minute warning.
What was that?
Got a 3-minute warning.
Okay. I'll give you these 6 bullet points on the problem of evil. Sort of kind of go over what I've been talking about. Okay, so yeah, evil exists because humans had the freedom to choose God, but instead we chose to be our own gods. That's the whole story of Eden. We had the opportunity. God came into the universe, presented himself, and we chose differently. And so we've been suffering ever since. 2, when we walked away from God in Eden, we chose a different Lord of the earth, and a Lord that was filled with issues that would have been avoided if we still had a connection to God and the tree of life. These things would have simply been prevented, natural disasters, diseases, but we decided we didn't want that. We chose a different world, one in which we would be our own gods, and we've been suffering ever since as a consequence of that. 3, although God could regularly intervene, he doesn't, because he wants our species to see the real consequences of a rebellion, which is a life without his presence and sanctification. As terrible as it is, the only way to learn the horrors of what a life without God is like is through what we have to go through right now. 4, natural laws have to work in regular ways of our actions to have any meaning. Otherwise, Billy and Jimmy could be sitting and trying to carve their meat with a steak knife, and the knife could bounce out of his hand and turn into rubber before it hits one of the kids. But that's not a real world. That's a cartoon world where actions don't have any meaning. We don't learn anything from that type of thing. And then, of course, the most important point is 5. God promises that this is not the end of all. This is not just a cruel joke. Everyone will come back in a resurrected manner who wants to. And so then there will sort of be this sort of sanctification process we've been moving through, where the evil that we've had to suffer through or had to endure or have caused will have some sort of meaning in our sanctification process individually. And then, of course, the final point is, of course, that Jesus, who is God in the flesh, did come and suffer along with us. So the idea that God does not care or is not involved in our suffering is just absurd from the Christian standpoint. because God entered time, was born as a pauper, lived as a pauper, and died as a criminal, suffering a gruesome, horrible death, feeling the full weight of human suffering. So the idea that Christianity is not sort of dealing with these issues is just false. There are numerous answers. I mean, I'm just basically going off what Clay Jones has argued in his book on evil. So when you're talking about these things, it's sort of like looking at evil in a tunnel vision. It's ignoring the whole answer that Christianity has given on these things.
I think the problem is when you look at the whole, it's all set up here. First, God knows what's going to happen if he puts a tree of knowledge, good and evil in the garden. He knows what the tree of life is going to happen. He knows if he leaves a serpent in there, yet he leaves a serpent who doesn't have our best interests at heart with his children that he loves, even though he knows if he does this, they're going to eat from a tree and cause all the suffering. When you look at the other things like disease, all the stuff, all the suffering coming into the world, this is all because of the way God set it up. It didn't have to be a situation to where if Adam and Eve disobeyed God, all the suffering would come into the world. This is just a decision. This is how God decided to create it.
Okay, so then
hold on. I'm still going.
What would be a better way with freedom?
I'm still going. It's okay. So I'm just talking about what's in the Bible. So the Bible basically has it in a way where God set it up, basically set them up to fail. And then he has this overcomplicated solution where he's going to have to come back. Going on a cross for a couple hours isn't nearly the same kind of suffering that most human beings, a lot of human beings throughout history have had to go through because of diseases that he put in place that wouldn't exist. The whole sin problem is there because God created a sin problem. He made it so that if they disobeyed him, there would be this sin issue. He made it so that Adam and Eve would pass this sinful nature on to their children, where he could have just ended it there. So, like, basically saying God fixes it by creating all these circumstances, like by setting a culture up by themselves, by doing things like circumcision and things. It just all doesn't make much sense at all.
Okay, so to quote Clay Jones here, because if you're going to say that there was a better way, I just have one simple question. I mean, if you can imagine a better way, then it's at least logically possible that if you can't imagine there's a better way, then at least logically possible there isn't a better way. If you're going to say there's a better way, then you need to actually provide that better way. Because if there's an omniscient God who says there is no better way, then and you're not omniscient, how can you say that there is a better way, not actually provided, where we don't take free will and freedom into consideration?
I guess the answer to that question would be a better way would be not to leave.
We're gonna get
leave your loved ones with someone else's serpent.
The last response. So given that Mike started, we'll give Skylar the last response. So Skylar, I'll let you respond, and then we're going to have to jump into the Q&A because
no worries. And this has been wonderful. Thank you, both of you, for doing this. And I know it gets passionate and stuff in here, but I appreciate the respectfulness everybody's kept. Just quickly, just to say, I mean, a better way would be not leaving your children with someone who doesn't have their best interests at heart, and knowing that if you leave your children with that being, all this will come about. All this suffering and things like that. So that might be a better way to do things. I'll leave it at that. I think it's just ironic that God does things that are counterproductive to his goal. At least the Christian does.
So we are going to move into the Q&A section, and thank you both. This has been epic. A lot of really interesting ideas, a lot of different rebuttals, and you guys have done reading and bringing different ideas here. So that's excellent. Exactly what we were hoping for. And for the Q&A, I do have a few questions, but for anybody who wants to add questions, please feel free and I will add them to the list. So first, Darwin's greatest hits. He has one question. This one was for Mike, or in other words, inspiring philosophy. And hopefully, Mike, you know the context of what Darwin's greatest hits is talking about here. He says, can you ask IP what he means by grounding?
By grounding what? Moral, ontological?
Yeah.
Context, grounding.
I think that's what he's referring to, but Darwin's greatest hits, are you still out there just so we can clarify that?
I mean, I kind of gave it in my moral argument. I mean, it's if there are moral facts and duties, if there's moral values and duties, they seem to be imply that they're grounded in a necessary rational source, because you just don't have obligations or prescriptions sort of floating out there in nothing. It doesn't really make sense to just say that. So, for example, Peter S. Williams says, I have moral obligations, but since I can't be obligated by anything non-personal, I must be obligated by something personal. Since there are objective moral obligations that transcend all finite persons, there must therefore be a transcendent personal reality to whom we are most fundamentally obligated. So if you have objective moral obligations, it just follows that they have to be grounded in someone who is giving the obligations. I mean, if that's what he's trying to get at, that's what I would respond with.
Gotcha. Okay, and I think he had just let me know, he says that IP uses the word grounding in his meta-ethics video. So that's what he was referring to. So I think we connected there.
Okay. Yeah, I would just refer to my video, is God the same as moral goodness? He may be referring to some responses he did. If that's what he's referring to, then we would have to discuss that, over a beer or something, because I mean, it was a long video and I just haven't had the time to fully respond to it. Because if I were to do a response, I do a 45-minute response and he'd do an hour response and I do an hour and a half. And I saw the video. I think I know what video he's referring to, and I saw it, and I don't agree, but as Bart Ehrman said in his debate with Robert Price in the first Q&A, someone got up there and was like, I wrote a 600-page book responding to you. Why haven't you responded? And Bart Ehrman was like, I'm busy. It's like, I saw it. I disagree with what you said, but frankly, I'm just doing other things in my life right now. So I think that's maybe what he's referring to. It's kind of coming back to me a little bit, but I would need to rewatch it all at this point because I'm busy and I saw it. I'm pretty sure I didn't agree, and I've just got busy with all sorts of other stuff. I'm sure, as you're all aware.
You bet. All right. We have a question. We have a couple of questions for Skylar. Let's see. First, for Skylar, we had, would you read the book Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan, who's an old, if I remember right, he's an Old Testament.
Oh, can I add something like that? Skylar, if you read it, I will buy it for you right now.
Just send me a copy. I'll read. I'm trying to think if I read it when I was younger. I didn't get to tell you guys. Well, I know, James, we talked earlier about it, but I was studying to be a minister at one point, and I used to read a lot of apologetic books. I don't know if I've read that one, but I would be happy to read it.
Okay, I'll send it to you right now.
Perfect. Send it. I mean, I don't want you to pay for it. I feel bad you paying for it. But
well, do you want? I already have a PDF of it.
Yeah, if you have your PDF, email me a PDF of it, and I'd be happy, even if it's off air, just to have a conversation after we read it. I think that would be a good. Maybe come back on here one time and talk about that book. So yeah, I love it. Send it to me. I'll read it.
Yeah, I'll see if I can find where did I save that thing? I'll find it.
Okay, cool.
Excellent. And if I had missed any questions for any other questions for Mike, let me know. I'm a little bit surprised we don't have more. Usually the theist that comes on, you get a lot of questions. And we have another one. This is from JMD Apologetics 101, who says, for Skylar, what would be your objection to Molinism concerning divine omniscience and human freedom?
Oh, I'd have to look into that, to be honest with you. I don't know if I can give you an honest answer right now. I'd have to look more into Molinism. I know a little bit about it, but not much.
You got it.
Just to be honest, be BSing my way through that.
Thank you for your honesty. I appreciate it. Then we have another one. This is actually, again, for Skylar.
Man, I feel lucky here. We're getting the questions.
A lot of attention.
I love it, man.
Jesus is Lord is their username, and they ask,
Lord.
Question for Skylar: can you or any human ever know the future exhaustively?
We have a history. Me and Jesus is Lord. I don't think so. I don't think we can know the. You said to know the future, unless there's some kind of crazy, time machine invention we invent in the future where we can see it. I don't think it's possible. But no, I don't think we can see the future.
Really interesting. Okay. Any other questions? Let's see. I'm scanning through. I think you got another one. No, we don't. This is a shy bunch.
I know. What's up with the questions, folks? Come on now.
This is the first. This is the biggest audience I've ever seen for a debate. And
no one wants to ask who has the better beard. I'm confused.
Oh man, yeah, seriously. I just started growing this out too. I hadn't grown it in a while. I did used to do a little beard strap kind of thing, but I decided to go. And I'm going on vacation next week. I'm like, you know what? I'm going to grow this beard out for this vacay.
Okay, let's see. Well, if nobody's going to ask one, I have one, and this is, am I allowed to ask? I mean,
Oh, please, please. I have no problem.
oh wait, hold on. There might be one. No, that's the same. Okay, so we got one more, and then we'll maybe get to mine if we have time. We have Darwin's Greatest Hits says, can you ask IP if he read Jeremy Coons' paper on the Euthyphro?
It rings a bell, but I have to go back and check my notes. I'm not sure. I cannot say yes or no right now. I mean, when I was studying to do my video on the moral argument, I read papers like 3 years ago. I mean, that's how far I try to research in advance before I even consider doing a video. I'd have to look at it. Probably if I read the abstract, I would know.
You got it. I can't help but ask this because I was actually, I have to be honest, I had lost a number of probability points with regard to whether or not I had thought the moral argument was sound. Me personally, James. And so I was like unsure this summer on whether or not I still thought the moral argument was sound. I used to be a big proponent of it, but then I was like, ooh, okay, I am a little bit less sure on whether or not my moral intuition counts. Now, Mike, you brought up a really good point tonight that maybe, like, frankly, kind of shocked me out of this and kind of made me think, like, ooh, hold on, there might be a cost if I'm such a skeptic. This is one in which, and I might have missed this, Skylar, forgive me if you gave an answer.
Please.
You might have given one because I'm doing a couple of things at once here. I think that Mike was maybe asking you, how do you justify your trust in your cognitive faculties, or how do you justify your intuition in those? Mm-hmm. And you had said, well, give me, Mike, give me Inspiring Philosophy a standard by which you would find it acceptable if I were to justify my intuition. And I had thought through this as I'm thinking through it. I'm like, ooh, okay, this is an interesting question. And obviously, I think you guys see the cost of like where Mike was going on this, where I'm kind of like, okay, as an agnostic about the moral argument, I'm starting to think, if I cannot justify, so namely, if I can say, hey, I'm using my intuition to trust my cognitive faculties are correct, why am I not allowed to use my intuition to trust that my moral, you might say, compass or perception of the world, this moral experience I have, why am I not allowed to use my intuition there? Now, of course, Skylar, you could give an example. You could say, well, hey, I'll tell you why, because my cognitive faculties are a different type of situation in which I'm justified in trusting my intuition. One, the type of justification that I can't use for my moral intuition. So that's a possibility. I'm open to that. Sure. But I'm kind of curious. I might have missed it. You might have already answered this, and forgive me if I'm running in circles on asking again.
You've got a good recap of everything so far. From what I understand in philosophy, that there are certain axioms that you have to accept, basically, within, I think, a human existence, right? Like you have to assume that you can be rational. You have to assume that you can exist, or you exist. And from what my understanding of axioms is, they're not justifiable. That's why they're axioms, like they're starting points, they're assumptions. So when we talk about the cognitive things we were talking about, like how do I know everything's working? Like my senses are working, right? I think about it in the sense of like, first, like that's what I was asking about the standard. Like what would be the ultimate standard in which I would appeal to tell me that, hey, I have a 100% perfect functioning senses, right? But what you can do is, like I said, you can go to doctors and have your senses checked by machines. You can have diagnostics done on you, done by things that aren't your mind. But I think at the root of it, though, I think you have to. It's even with science. Like, I think it's not comparable. Like when we talk about morality. And the idea of, what was the word we use? Intuition, like these intuitions, right? I think we're using this word in a different way, the way the two of us are using it, right? I don't think it's intuition. I think the way I use it, the way I'm talking about recognizing things is by looking at evidence and coming to conclusions, right? Like I think the reason I believe my senses are working properly is because I've been to a doctor. Like that's evidence. And recently, I got in a car accident about a month or so back. Couple more months than that back. But it was a serious accident. Doctors checked everything head to toe, right? There's evidence that leads me to believe that they're working properly. Now, when it comes to like morality, it's like we're saying that there's some kind of experience, which is the way it was kind of defined, that makes me believe that morals are real. And they just like, and it seems like we're just kind of assuming it. So I don't get that same experience when it comes to morals. So maybe I can't speak to it. I hope I didn't ramble too much there, but I'm just trying to give you the best answer I can for what's going on here.
Gotcha. I'm going to go to a different question because okay. I think that one thing though that makes me still wonder, well, we'll go to a different question. We might come back to it because this is a time for other people to ask questions. So we do have one for Inspiring Philosophy, which is, they said, how do you explain free will after reading Romans 8 and 9? Yeah, exactly that. Bowz, B-O-W-Z, asks Inspiring Philosophy, how do you explain free will after reading Romans 8 and 9?
Okay, well, I think it's referring to, like, is he referring to the potter and the clay thing?
That's my guess. Okay,
yeah. Well, I think one of the things we have to remember is we're taking the full Bible in the context here. And, there are clear verses of free will. As JMD was talking about earlier, was Molinism. And that's the sort of the view I started to take. So it's the sort of view where you sort of able to combine the predestination ideas along with the free will ideas. And what Molinism is basically asserting is that God, in his natural knowledge, can actualize all sorts of possible worlds. I'm sorry, that's his forgetting the actual term for it, but that's like the first level of knowledge. His middle knowledge is the next step. This is where God can only actualize things that work with free species of humanity. So, for example, as I'm a free creature myself who is able to make free will choices, God can actualize a possible world where I would freely choose to be a fireman, or I would freely choose to be a cop. But there may be no possible world out there where I would ever have freely chosen to be a hairdresser or to wear a purple shirt like you are doing right now. Like maybe I would never do that because I don't like the way I look in purple. So that the argument that the Molinist is trying to make is they're trying to look at these predestination verses and they're trying to look at the free will verses and they're saying, okay, yeah, God does predestine things, but it's in conjunction with working with free will through his middle knowledge. So I'm going to elaborate this more in November when I do a video on it. I'm trying to explain this more, and I'll be able to put charts up, which will be probably helpful in explaining this. But the way the Molinist looks at that and goes, yeah, we understand God is sort of predestining, he's sort of working with humanity, but he has actualized a world that works with free will of creatures. He's actualized the best possible world where there is still free will, where people are still free to actually make choices. And so, So why there's still sort of things like evil and suffering, because God is trying to work with free creatures. So God is then the people so God actualizes the world where the most number of people, or anyone who possibly would accept him, actually does. So he actualizes that basic world. And what he's basically doing is he's molding those people the way that he would have planned, along with their free choices they would have picked back in his middle knowledge. Now, I know this can get kind of confusing and sort of explaining it. That's why I'm planning on doing a whole video trying to elaborate it. And I think it will help better when I actually have the charts up and sort of explaining this a little bit more.
You got it. We've got another question. This one is for Mike. And they had said, ask Mike if the conquest harem commands are actual and have divine intent, regardless of the extent of their fulfillment, which would be irrelevant to the moral nature of the command.
The conquest commands?
Yes. They refer to them as harem commands. I'm not sure if this is... I'm not exactly sure what they mean. It's H-E-R-E-M, so not usually how you'd spell like a harem of like...
Well, they do. I mean, God never commanded that. I mean, Jesus is pretty clear that God in the beginning made them male and female, and that was how it was really intended. I mean, yes, Solomon and David had multiple wives, but that was never condoned or accepted by God. That was just a description of what was actually happening. So then we need to distinguish between the descriptive and prescriptive text. As regards to the conquest of Canaan, yeah, that was commanded, but it's understood within the ancient Near Eastern context of conquest epics and steles and those sorts of things. So John Walton's book, The Lost World of the Israelite Conquest, Paul Copan's book, Is God a Moral Monster, talk about this. So like, for example, when they attacked Ai, it says all the men of the city ran out after them. But then it says Joshua turned and attacked the city and the people remaining in there. Okay, well, I thought all of them ran out. Well, it's understood within the context of they're just being hyperbolic. So a lot of this stuff is hyperbolic. It talks about they destroyed all of these people, no one left standing. But then you get to Joshua 23, Joshua 24, you're talking about all these extra people that are still living among them. So basically what the scholars have noted about this is that if you want to look at this as in how the Egyptians talked about their own war epics, or the Sumerians, is that they were basically just talking like we do with modern sports game. We utterly slaughtered or we utterly annihilated them. It's not meant to be taken literal. It's just understood within ancient Near Eastern conquest epics. The main command for them was to drive the inhabitants out of the land, and they even failed to do that. It was not necessarily to murder literally living soul and creature. Joshua says there's still many people living among you. Don't worship their gods. Don't chase after, the customs and the things they do. And of course, we know in Judges, they start doing it anyway. So within other sort of the conquest, they were commanded to take over the promised land, but the actual descriptions going on there need to be understood in terms of ancient Near Eastern hyperbole.
Gotcha. And I have a question that I'm like, I think this guy is serious, and I just say that because his name is Rich Howard, and he has a picture of, I think, Richard Carrier as his profile picture. Must be a Richard Carrier reader. He asks, ask Michael if Jesus existed.
Yes. You can watch the debate I did back in on St. Patrick's Day on the NonSequitur Show, where I debated Godless Engineer on that. Yeah, there's plenty of evidence Jesus existed. I'm actually currently reading Richard Carrier's book, his very long one, and I just finished chapter 2. So I'm going to keep reading that and read more of his arguments. I just got to the part where he goes over the ascension of Isaiah, and I could say a lot about that. Apparently it dates to Mark. Okay. But yeah, there's a lot of issues with the whole mysticist theory that Jesus didn't exist, and I could probably go on for hours about that.
Gotcha. Yada 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 asks, how does the first Doctor Strange movie rank in the Marvel universe?
I thought it was good. I thought I enjoyed it. I like Doctor Strange though. I think he's one of my favorite characters. I'm a pretty huge Marvel fan, so I don't know. Pete, some people told me they didn't like it, and I'm not going to get into a debate about that because I don't really care if you liked it or not, because it's not like objective morality. It's just a preference. That's how it manifests in reality. Movie taste and preference don't manifest that way. But yeah, I liked it. I enjoyed it. I hope they make a sequel because they left it on a cliffhanger, obviously, and that annoyed me because I want to see the guy. It was really weird because in the movie, Doctor Strange's best buddy is really in the comics his biggest rival, and they kind of set it up. They're going to fight in the next movie, so I'm hoping they get to that.
That's awesome. Skylar, do you have an opinion on whether Doctor Strange was the best in the Marvel comic universe?
Another terrible example of me not watching comic book movies.
You're a terrible person.
You're a
terrible person.
The only one I really liked, I used to like the old Batman movies and stuff like that, but it was The Watchmen was my favorite comic book movie. So it's by far to me the best story. It's a little darker, and look, you have a being who becomes a god, basically. And him dealing with the ramifications in his life was so interesting. He literally, at the end of the movie, spoiler alert, goes off to make new universes at the end. And this was a man at one point. So I don't know. I like the ethical struggles the dude went through. And there's just so many great scenes in that movie also.
The best superhero movie is The Dark Knight. The Joker's performance is astronomical. I'm sorry, you're just objectively wrong on this. But.
Maybe.
We've got a couple more serious questions going back. we have a number of people have asked about 3 different things being hyperbole. One person had asked if the resurrection was hyperbole. One person had asked if the story of Job is hyperbole. And then Doug asks, when the Old Testament says the Lord said to Moses, does inspiring philosophy say that really happened? That the Jesus or Yahweh said something to Moses? So you could say that it seems that they're asking, is this hyperbole when 1, Jesus resurrected in the New Testament, 2, story of Job in the Old Testament, and 3, when the Old Testament talks about the Lord saying to Moses, regardless of what it says, just the Lord.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, this is a sort of a slippery slope fallacy, because certain parts are clearly hyperbole, like Jesus saying, I am the true vine. That must mean they all are hyperbole. I mean, not necessarily. It's how they're basically written. I love how we do this with the Bible, but when we read Hamlet, we understand there's clearly metaphors and hyperbole in there, but we understand when they're being literal and not. Sure, certain passages in Hamlet are even still debated. I remember being in college, we were going over Hamlet, and we were debating certain passages, if they were meant to be hyperbolic or if they were meant to be understood in this certain way or that certain way. But I mean, we understood the basic story. So I mean, I apply the same common sense, the same exegesis we would perform in any other text. We get that idea. Now with the book of Job, there is actually some scholarly debate about this. Some people do think it is just sort of like a parable, like one of Jesus's parables or not. I'm not really sure about that. I'm kind of on the fence with regard to that topic because, it is written in a huge poetic ancient Near Eastern fashion. But I mean, I think the theological points I go over in my book, The Book of Job Explained, and how it relates to Christianity and how Christians should see this book and whatnot in there. So with Job or whatnot, I've not really decided on that. It is definitely written in a very poetic type fashion. But then again, oral cultures wrote in poetic fashions all the time. I mean, that's just what they did. And so, they often would repeat things, like Genesis 1:27 is repeated 3 times in the beginning. So God made them in his image. In his image, he made them male and female. He made, it's repeated because it's an oral culture and they're trying to force memorization on it. So, I mean, it's possible with Job, but with the resurrection or with God specifically doing certain actions, it's really hard to interpret those that certain way, because a simple exegesis performed on the text by scholars would not suggest that those were written in the same way John 15:1 is, where Jesus says, I'm the true vine. So I think, just use the same common sense we would use with something like Hamlet, and it should all work itself out. I mean, will everything be perfect? No, there'll always be little things here debated there, but you get the general idea.
What about all the treatment of women in the Old Testament? Like how they, like the laws and rules as far as the way they were supposed to be treated. Like, was that all hyperbole also? Like, were women treated equally with respect and not sold to each other?
It goes back to the didactic law code and Jesus telling them that their laws were given because their hearts were hardened. So we're assuming ultra literalism, and we're assuming that was not encompassed in moral progress itself, of God moving the people along to get them to a better point. So, I mean, even Christine Hayes, who did her excellent series on Open Yale University, notes this was quite revolutionary, comparing it to older laws like the Code of Hammurabi or Lipid Ishtar or Namu or whatnot, things like that. So that's how I would answer the same thing I was saying earlier.
But couldn't God just say, no, don't do that? Like, I mean, they believe in God, obviously. They worship this God, and this is who they're following. Like, whatever rules he's going to give them, they're supposed to follow it. I'm sure they may not obey it perfectly.
Yeah, right? He did, and then they did it anyway.
But don't you think one of them should have probably been, hey, don't treat your women like their property and sell them off to each other?
Okay, well, you're assuming slaves were actually treated as property.
Hold on. You don't believe in ancient Hebrew culture? They didn't sell women as property?
Again, the actual
that's factually just incorrect. I'm sorry, within history, it's incorrect.
Again, there's a whole series on this with regarding to how the actual word is used and how it has a much broader meaning. It's not like antebellum slavery, as numerous scholars have pointed out.
No one brought up antebellum slavery. I simply said that, like, the women were treated like their property and they were sold as property.
Slaves were not
trying to tell me that in Hebrew culture that wasn't a thing.
Slaves were not as property for the same reason that if they had the same rights to life as in Exodus 21, if you hit them, you let them go free. If you kill a slave, then you have to.
I'm not talking about slaves. I'm talking about women. Women were sold. They didn't have to be a slave to be sold as property.
So what are you specifically referring to then?
How women were sold to families to marry off to husbands. Like, how about are the times where women were basically, after men went and killed all the adults, they took the virgins?
Yeah, there's a whole video. Tecton TV did a whole video on Numbers 31. If you want to go into the details of it, but I don't think I really have a lot of time, considering we've already been on here for 2 hours to get into that. But Tecton TV has a video called Numbers 31 where he goes into the details regarding that. And again, it's taking a lot of this out of context with regards to what they're actually saying. These are not sex slaves.
I asked you a question. I didn't say this was the situation. I asked you if this was, and you didn't give me an answer. Like
well,
you
yeah,
said,
I told you I don't have
ways.
time
So
right now to go into a long
once
detail.
again, a yes or no question. Did in Hebrew times were women sold as property? It is.
Okay.
It's either it either wasn't, women either weren't sold as property or they were. If
No,
they
it's
weren't,
not.
you could say they weren't sold as property.
It's not that simple. You have to go into a
We
lot of
go to the
cultural
next
context.
question. Okay.
So we have 24 seconds left, which is hopefully, if you're willing, we can just squeeze in one last question, because I honestly hate turning this off because it's been honestly a blast. So we have one last question, if you guys are all right with that. It'll take us like a couple minutes over, but for Skylar, if I understand correctly, Browse asks, you believe the book of Revelation. What is your stance on the entirety of the Bible? If you don't believe the rest, why just Revelation?
Oh, I didn't necessarily just believe in Revelation. I was just using it as a context point, right? To like argue within the Christian religion. So there's a lot of different. Obviously, when you know, James, you say you're a Christian, or IP says he's a Christian. Like, you guys may have a lot of things you agree on, but there may be little differences, right? And then you compare many different Christians out there. I'm just assuming the Christianity that I hear quite a bit, which is, I think, and I appreciate, don't get me wrong, I appreciate Michael IP's position. It's a little bit more nuanced on everything, and as with yours. But like, of the Christians that I tend to meet are Bible-believing Christians, where they don't take your positions, right? I think you see it a lot in society. So what I try to do when I'm quoting scripture is, what I'm trying to do is an internal critique. I'm using what the Bible says to show the moral contradictions of God. That's the point of me bringing that up. As far as like what I actually think about the Bible, it depends. It depends on the chapter, like which book. I think that a lot of them were these stories were from ancient Sumerian cultures. I think that a lot of them have moral messages. I think I look at Genesis. It's like some kind of parable or allegory. Job would be some kind of parable or allegory. But it would depend on the chapter, what the story was, and each one would probably be different. But as a whole, I think the Bible was a way of people trying to explain the world around them. And the morals, like slavery, I obviously don't believe God really wants slavery or wants to hurt children or anything. Obviously, if there was a God, I don't think he would want to do that. But if someone believes the Bible and takes what it actually says in the scripture at face value, God does these things. So that's, I hope, a good enough answer for you.
So we're going to wrap up, just to respect the debaters' time as well as everybody else's. We had said that it would be 45 minutes of debate, 45 minutes namely on moral realism, and 45 minutes on the moral argument. We touched on the moral argument at first.
A little bit.
So for those of you who are watching, thanks for tuning in. We are having another debate next week. That's going to be a debate on evolution. So namely, evolutionists, or people who believe in evolution, whatever you want to call it, people who happen to believe in evolution are willing to defend evolution, take the affirmative stance. And then there are, you could say, skeptics of evolution, who are going to ask questions and say, is the evidence good enough? So very excited for that. We're planning on a tag team debate. So just want to say thank you for everybody tuning in. Thank you for the questions. And most of all, thank you for the debaters for this very intense and just a lot of rapid fire in terms of ideas. And so thank you very much for the debaters for participating tonight, both Mike and Skylar.
Thank you, man. It was awesome.
So, yeah, thank you. And so those of you who are watching, thanks again for tuning in, and we will hopefully see you next week.